Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. We're going to do Delusional Part 9 today on Deleuze's thoughts about Marx, based on one of those essays from the book called Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage that we've been going through. So, as usual, we got Chief Keefe here, aka Tim Keefe, and you want to start off with a bit of an introduction to probably Marx, I would say.
Yes, we're doing Karl Marx. Boo! Boo!
Evil
Boo!
postmodern neo-Marxist.
The enemy of all capitalists everywhere. All right, so with that out of the way. Yeah, so with this essay, we're going to take a turn from talking about metaphysics, empiricism, and look a little bit more to social thought, because that's what you do with Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see, starting off. So, Andrew, you've read and you've seen videos, I'm sure, about Karl Marx before.
Yeah, and I've read the Communist Manifesto a few years ago. I don't remember much of it.
Okay, so what are your general impressions about Marx? Are they positive? Are they negative? Are they somewhere in the middle? Did you actually get what he was saying?
Well, when I read it, I didn't have a very deep knowledge of philosophy, like not anywhere near as deep as I do now. Not that I'm an expert or anything, but I know a lot more about philosophy. And I think that if I read it now, I probably would appreciate more of it. Although I do remember that when I read it at the time, I thought that Marx actually made some pretty good points, but I understand the common criticisms that people have about Marx. Although, like, with with learning more about philosophy recently, like I've said, and also like we were talking about that new Cuck philosophy video that sort of analyzes what Jordan Peterson says about Marx in his debate with Slavoj Zizek, that a lot of what seems like a lot of common tropes that public intellectuals seem to say about Marx often seem to be kind of inaccurate. So I'm interested to learn more about the details that people often get wrong about Marx. Well, not necessarily, and understanding that, and a lot of people have problems with this type of thinking, that you can do that sort of thing, try to understand the details further without like advocating for Marxism or being a communist or something crazy like that.
Yes, I mean the main thing that upsets me when people talk about Marx is they've only read the Communist Manifesto. They haven't read anything else by Marx. Now, his early works before he landed in England, you can kind of skip those. Communist Manifesto, it's an important text, which he co-wrote with Friedrich Engels, by the way. This was not just Marx himself. But
that was the case with Capital too, right?
No, that was not the case with Capital.
Okay.
Marx wrote Capital, of which there are 3 volumes.
Oh, okay.
The first volume was the most complete. The second one, a little less complete. And then the third one was just cobbled together by Engels because Marx had died at the time. So there's another problem here, is that if anybody has read Capital, they only read the first volume. They don't read the second and the third volume. Nor do they read the Grundrisse, which were the preparatory writings that Marx had done from Capital. I mean, I think I've recommended this to you first, is if anybody really wants to get into Marx, of course, read the Communist Manifesto and go to David Harvey, whom I have mentioned before in the context of postmodernism, one of the more famous living Marxists today, who has done a video series and a companion to Marx's Capital, all 3 volumes. Really take the time to get into those and see what Marx is doing in examining capitalism, which I would have to agree with Harvey is very relevant to us today.
I like what I've seen of videos of Harvey discussing philosophy and such as postmodernism and Marxism, and what I've read of his, but I didn't know about that video series. I should check that out.
Right. He started doing that 2010. And I think he did the last ones in 2011, 2012. So they've been up for a while. And ever since then, he's written other books on Marx, capitalism, and so on. And he has a podcast series I've been listening to. It's it's intermittent, but he's just again fleshing out the themes. He himself in the lecture series mentions that he's been reading and writing about Marx since the late 60s. So he's got 40 odd some years of really deep study in lots of different seminars and probably reading it every which way you could, even a deconstructivist reading of Marx. So he really knows the material inside and out, and he's a valuable resource. Now, when you mentioned about postmodernism, I had mentioned that in the series I did with James and the Jive podcast in the first episode about, what do Marxists have to say about postmodernism? They don't like it. Well, Harvey was one of those, particularly the one book that came out in 1999 The Condition of Postmodernity, a Marxist critique, more or less, of postmodernity. Not to the same extent that Jameson did, but I'd say it's a companion volume to the Jameson one.
Yeah, and we've clarified several times at this point, and like going back to when you mentioned this in your 3-part series with James about postmodernism, and we've discussed it several times on here, that Marxists really don't like postmodernists, generally speaking, and offer some of the best criticisms of postmodernism.
I'd have to agree, yes. I'd have to agree. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into Marx himself. Now, it's going to be a quick summary, just like I did with Hegel, because there's a lot to cover in Marx that we're just not going to have time to do so. But let me see. So I'm going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy here. Let's see, what are some interesting nuggets we could pull out of here. Okay, so we'll start with the economic and the philosophical manuscripts, which predate the Manifesto and predate Capitalism. Marx is important with Hegel because the two are almost two sides of the same coin. However,
your audio got cut off for about 10 seconds there.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So interesting material on private property, communism, and on money, as well as developing Marx's critique of Hegel. And I was saying that Hegel is important to Marx because the two of them are almost two sides of the same coin. Hegel was the one, as we saw in the previous podcast, to advocate for absolute idealism and the dialectic and the march of history, progress, and so on and so forth. Marx took a lot of that, but, as he himself said, he flipped Hegel on his head. Instead of it being in the other world somewhere, it is in this world, a materialistic approach.
Right.
Okay. However, the manuscripts are best known for their account of alienated labor. This is a very important Marxist theme about the alienation of labor. Here, Marx famously depicts the worker under capitalism as suffering from 4 types of alienated labor. First, from the product, which as soon as it is created is taken away from its producer. Second, in productive activity, work, which is experienced as a torment. Third, from species being, for humans produced blindly and not in accordance with their truly human powers. Finally, from other human beings, where the relation of exchange replaces the satisfaction of mutual need. That these categories overlap in some respects is not a surprise, given Marx's remarkable methodological ambition in these writings. Essentially, he attempts to apply a Hegelian deduction of categories to economics, trying to demonstrate that all the categories of bourgeois economics, wages, rent, exchange, profit, etc., are ultimately derived from an analysis of the concept of alienation. Consequently, each category of alienated labor is supposed to be deducible from the previous one. However, Marx gets no further than deducing categories of alienated labor from each other. Quite possibly, in the course of writing, he came to understand that a different methodology is required for approaching economic issues. Nevertheless, we are left with a very rich text on the nature of alienated labor. The idea of non-alienation has to be inferred from the negative. With the assistance of one short passage at the end of the text on James Mill, in which non-alienated labor is briefly described in terms which emphasize both the immediate producer's enjoyment of production as a confirmation of his or her powers, and also the idea that production is to meet the needs of others, thus confirming for both parties our human essence as mutual dependence. Both sides of our species essence are revealed here, our individual human powers and our membership in the human community. Okay, so the thing about production here is this is man's mastery over his material conditions.
Right.
Okay. So way back in the day, and this is, Marx is writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution, large-scale industrial capitalism. Man is taking the raw materials to produce something, growing food to eat, building his own shelter, making his own clothes, and so on and so forth. So this is to not master his environment, but to take the raw materials that nature, the environment provides to survive and to thrive. So this is what production is. And production was small scale and it was localized. Okay. And Marx talks about this in the history of what predated capitalism and then capitalism, and as he noted, in the 19th century. So there was the production for themselves and production for the others of the community. However, when you're getting to industrial capitalism, this is the alienation from one's labor. So if you ever done a factory job, which I have, you're working in the factory, you're assembling different pieces, or you're working in injection mold or something like that. You're producing something, but you do not partake in what you produce. It is for something else, for somebody else's consumption. You are alienated for your labor because it is not something that you have made. And what you get a wage, money, for the effort that you produce, which in turn that you use to pay your rent, buy food, spend on luxuries, entertainment, or whatever it is. So that's the difference between an artisanal type labor, where you made your own stuff, to working in a factory. Now, again, we're talking about Marxist time. You're working in a factory, and so this is where the alienation comes in. And in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, this is where Marx really starts to flesh out the concept of alienated labor.
Okay, so is it the case that he's saying that not necessarily capitalism as a whole, but industrialization applied to capitalism basically creates the circumstances in which people are alienated by work?
They're alienated from their labor. Okay. So, I mean, stop and think about it. So, Marx is writing in the 19th century with industrial capitalism. Fast forward to 21st century capitalism. Most of us work at jobs that are, maybe they're cognitively sophisticated, like if you're a computer programmer or something, or you do some kind of a labor job, like working for a moving company, again, working in a factory or whatever it is. But again, our labors, now maybe this is not so much the case if you're talking about cognitive type labor. If I write my own program, my own software, I can use it to do X, Y, and Z, which is making my life better and making those of my community and my family better. Whereas for your standard labor jobs and even a service job, you're not really benefiting from that. Okay. So if you're a barista in Starbucks, you make yourself a cup of coffee, you consume it. Okay. That is for your own consumption, if they allow you to do that. But if you're slinging coffee all day and you're serving pastries, you're alienated from your labor because you're not producing anything for yourself. You're getting a wage for that, or a salary for that. And talking about the alienation of the labor involved. Okay. Which, you're not partaking of what you produce. Then there's the psychological aspect of it, of the alienation in place. Okay, makes sense?
So clarify here. I remember from that Cuck philosophy video, and I found this interesting. A lot of critics of Marx and Marxism say that he only has a negative view of capitalism. But I remember from that Cuck philosophy and video in particular, one of them was saying that he's not, like, Marx is not necessarily moralizing against capitalism. He's saying that, like, these are the circumstances that are created by industrialization, so something like that.
Yes, the common criticism is that Marx is against capitalism. Right. In a sense, he is, but he also admires capitalism, and this is where reading the wider body of work and reading very critically. Sure, Marx, as did a lot of other critics of capitalism, even to this day, when they talk about how capitalism is morphed and what it is right now, is that capitalism has given us the bounty that we experience. What we're doing right here with communicating over the internet, this in part was a product of capitalism. Okay, so we clearly benefit from this. And Marx said, sure, Capitalism has been a wonderful thing for raising lots of people out of poverty, consumer goods, higher standard of life, and so on and so forth. The problem is capitalism also contains within it contradictions, one of which leads to alienation of labor. Okay, so now, yes, one can make the argument that the factory worker is a lot better off, this is in the 19th century, is better off than working in the fields and starving because a crop fails. Okay, that much is not in question. Would you rather work in the fields or would you rather work 14 hours a day in a factory? Given that choice, I probably would want to work in a factory. However,
Right.
the problem is that is not necessarily the best life that somebody can live. Given the circumstances and given the choices, yes, it is, but it is not the best life that one can live. And so this is one microcosm of the wider macrocosm of capitalism, where capitalism has given us all these great things, but it also has a downside to it, which people, they might want to talk about it, or they brush under the rug, or they say that something must be done for the state. There's a welfare system and things like that to prevent some of the excesses of capitalism from really taking control.
Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
that in particular seems to be much more common in our modern era. Like there being social democracies, like here in Canada, I would say it's technically a social democracy, and then a lot of the Nordic countries like Sweden and so on and so forth that have more of that system than America commonly does.
Yeah, social welfare state.
Yeah.
But the social welfare state comes at a cost.
Yeah.
It comes at a huge cost in some respects.
Oh
But
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but again, the point is that nowhere does Marx ever say, I'm strictly against capitalism. He does sing the
Mm-hmm.
praises of capitalism at certain points. But again, what he is doing in Capital is he is examining capitalism and the workings of capital and its contradictions, because capitalism is rife of contradictions. Hopefully, he was saying, this is a teleological approach, is that one day capitalism would just break down. The socialist revolution would happen, and then one would overthrow capitalism for some kind of a socialist or communist state, which is more in line with one species being, where all of your material needs are taken care of. But, and Marx was a humanist about this, one can flourish a lot better as a human under a socialist or communist type of environment than it is under a capitalist environment.
That the last part about advocating for a revolution, or at least saying that one will happen, is one thing in particular, that problem in particular, I would say that people have with Marx.
Yes, right. Why is this? Because they can point to the failed communist states of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
including this day with North Korea, probably the worst example that exists.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, for
just look at
sure.
North Korea. It's a failed state. Yes, it is. Would one call it a Marxist state? I doubt it. Would one call it a communist state? Sure, it would. But North Korea is a bizarre place as well. And you're too young to remember the Eastern Bloc, but the Eastern Bloc was uneven. East Germany was different from Albania, was different from Armenia, was different from Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. So all of those countries had described themselves as communist, and they received a lot of support from the Soviet Union, but they were not uniform in their approach of how they introduced communism. And in fact, a lot of them were repressive because they were
Okay.
run by shitheads,
Yeah.
in effect.
So do you think that that them being run by shitheads is like more of the problem than communism itself? And like also um, like you said, I don't remember that division because I was born the year the Berlin Wall came down. But also, what exactly is the difference between communism and Marxism?
So I'd say that Marxism is the study of Marx and
Okay.
Marxist philosophy. Communism is, I'd say, more ruled by the Communist Party. So it's a political system. Marxism, I would not say, is a political system. It's more of a philosophical system, which, because of how much that Marx wrote and that he changed over the years and how much he wrote, is kind of consistent kind of cohesive, but really not. It's not tightly cohesive. That's the thing. And again, it really bothers me when somebody critiques Marx, and what do? They immediately point to the Communist Manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
They've not spent any time really getting into the 3 volumes of Capital or the Grundrisse or even the economic and philosophical manuscripts. When you were looking at, I watched just a little bit of it, the debate between Peterson and Zizek. Does Peterson ever mention anything about alienation?
No.
That's a core Marxist concept.
Yeah. And
The
we
alienation from one's labor.
and we know from I think Hegel talks about that a fair deal too, right?
He does, yeah. So
Yeah.
Marx took a lot from Hegel. The two, there would be no Marx without Hegel. And Hegel himself requires quite a bit of time and effort in study.
Yeah, he's pretty fucking complex.
Yes. Okay. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and press on to the theses on Feuerbach. Okay, so Feuerbach was a philosopher, a contemporary of Marx at the time. Ludwig Feuerbach, I won't get too much into him, but just reading the entry here. The theses on Feuerbach contain one of Marx's most memorable remarks. Quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it." This is thesis number 11. Let me say this again. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it.
Okay.
However, the 11 theses as a whole provide, in the compass of a couple of pages, a remarkable digest of Marx's reaction to the philosophy of his day. Several of these have been touched on already. So here I will concentrate only in the first and most overtly philosophical thesis. Continuing. In the first thesis, Marx states his objections to all hitherto existing materialism and idealism. Materialism is complemented for understanding the physical reality of the world. Materialism is a philosophy, but is criticized for ignoring the active role of the human subject in creating the world we perceive. Idealism, at least as developed by Hegel, understands the active nature of the human subject, but confines it to thought or contemplation. The world is created through the categories we impose upon it. Marx combines the insights of both traditions to propose a view in which human beings do indeed create, or at least transform, the world they find themselves in. But this transformation happens not in thought, but through actual material activity, not through the imposition of sublime concepts, but through the sweat of their brow, with picks and shovels. This historical version of materialism, which transcends and thus rejects all existing philosophical thought, is the foundation of Marx's later theory of history. As Marx puts it in the 1844 manuscripts, quote, "Industry is the real historical relationship of nature to man," end quote. This thought, derived from reflection on the history of philosophy, together with the experience of social and economic realities as a journalist, sets the agenda for all Marx's future work.
Okay, so talking about changing the world, I understand based on that sort of talk that why people would interpret Marx as more political than philosophical. But I that's also interesting, like basically what you were mentioning there, going back to turning Hegel's idealism on its head. That's interesting.
Right. So, in summary of what the theses talk about is you have materialism and you have idealism, which leading up to Marx were, you could say, the two main philosophical schools. So either the world is completely material or the world is completely idealistic, Hegelian thought. And remember, what we were reading the last time is the traditional metaphysical reading of what Hegel is, the absolute idealism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So Marx isn't looking at this in a metaphysical way then, right?
No, not necessarily. So philosophically speaking, I would say when you're reading the theses and you let it sink in for a bit, it kind of makes sense because today we would talk about, well, sure, there's a material world. Here's my desk, my car outside. I can feel rain on my face. This is a material world we live in. But we also have thoughts and feelings, desires, and so on, which are not material, at least if you don't reduce them to brain states. So with thought, man is able to as I mentioned earlier, take the sweat of his brow and transform physical reality into something that benefits himself and benefits others.
Mastering
Again,
nature.
well, I wouldn't say mastering nature. It is you're using raw materials to better oneself.
Okay.
Growing your own food, creating your own shelter, and so on and so forth. This is what primitive man did centuries ago, and then we just got better at it. So instead of saying, yes, the world is completely material, and yes, the world is completely idealistic, it's a synthesis of the two.
Oh, okay.
We are
I think
we are
that
thinking
that
we are
seems to be something that people often get wrong about Marx. Like I hear people all the time saying that he's saying that the world is all material.
right. Now you notice what we're doing by reading through the encyclopedia article. This is the lead up. These are early significant texts in Marx leading up before we even get to the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
And remember that Marx was a philosopher. He wrote his PhD dissertation on Democritus and the atomists. Okay. So one could say that Marx was a philosopher. He was trained as a philosopher from an early age. Then, as a career, he was a journalist commenting on, you know, it was a significant time when he came of age in 1848 when a bunch of revolutions were happening in Europe at the time, not just in Germany. So it's looking at, the breaking down of the old order, the old aristocratic feudalist order, moving into something, going into the Renaissance, which one could say contained the seeds of capitalism. And now we're starting to see in the 19th century large-scale industrial capitalism and how this is transforming the world. So to say that the materialist is not important is being dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
However, to say that everything is material is also to be dishonest, because we know from being thinking beings, we have thoughts, desires, feelings, and so on. And we use these, again, as I said, to transform physical reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, one could say to master reality, but I step back from that because that's a little bit, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that.
I'm
I
not
would stick,
saying that I'm not saying that we do.
yeah, I would say you're transforming reality, transforming physical reality.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, like you're you're creating ways to manipulate your environment for your own needs and desires, kind of, I guess, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. That's what
So
I mentioned.
what was it later on in his life where Marx and like Lenin, well, like Lenin and Trotsky in particular, they were sort of like connected to Marx in relation to the Russian Revolution, and is that like another reason that people see Marx as so political?
Well, Marx certainly was political. I'm
Okay,
not sure. I mean, I think we covered this before. Is that the distinctive thing about Lenin is that he maybe didn't accept everything that was in Marx, but he certainly understood that to overthrow the old order, there had to be a revolution. The revolution, according to Marx and Engels, was to happen at some point,
so
almost
they
organic.
so that is that correct me if I'm wrong, but the crucial distinction there is that Marx and Engels were not advocating for it, they were just saying that it's going to happen in the future.
They said that it was going to happen. Now
Okay.
they were political with the International Workers' Party, which was to unify industrial workers, of which there were many, in contradistinction to a very small group of the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. Okay.
Okay.
So with Lenin, this wasn't going to happen soon enough. You needed to have a vanguard party, a very small cadre of people who could understand what was going on and then push this faster. And so this is where the Russian Revolution and then the Russian Civil War took place. Okay.
Okay.
Overthrowing the Tsar and the old order and then ushering in the first communist state, really, on a large scale, the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah,
But
they're like Marx is certainly it sounds like Marx is certainly connected to the Russian Revolution, but not as directly as Lenin or Trotsky.
no, it's more theoretical. No,
Okay.
Marx and Lenin never knew each other. Marx died, I think, when did he die? What was that? 1883. Okay, so this was long before
Oh yeah.
1917 when the Russian Revolution took place.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Also, the revolution, in part, was an outgrowth of World War One. So World War One had finished in 1914. 3 years later, the Russian Revolution.
Right.
All right. So moving right along, let's go ahead to economics. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. How much do I want to get in here? Sure, I'll go ahead and cover this. All right. So this is this is a summary of Capital. Okay. Capital Volume 1 begins with an analysis of the idea of commodity production. A commodity is defined as a useful external object produced for exchange on a market, for example, a piece of clothing. Thus, two necessary conditions for commodity production are the existence of a market, in which exchange can take place, and a social division of labor, in which different people produce different products, without which there would be no motivation for exchange. So the division of labor is somebody makes the shirt, somebody grows the food, somebody does iron work, and so on. Nobody can do it all. Marx suggests that commodities have both use value, a use in other words, and an exchange value, initially to be understood as their price. So the use value of a shirt, for example, is that I wear it and it protects me from the elements. That's the use value. But the exchange value is how much is it worth to somebody else?
Okay.
Okay. Understand the distinction between a use value and an exchange value?
Yeah, like the use value sounds like basically the object's purpose, and the exchange value sounds like what the utility of that object is worth monetarily.
Right. What's it worth? Now, it could be monetarily or it could be by barter. I swap my shirt for um, a basket of rutabagas. Okay.
What are rutabagas?
A type of vegetable.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of those.
Let's substitute carrots. Okay. So for a
Okay.
basket of carrots, I'll give you my shirt. Okay.
Okay.
That's the exchange value. You
Right.
you believe that the shirt is worth as much or more than your basket of carrots, and so you
Hmm.
exchange. That's the exchange value.
So
Use
was there much of a history of economics before Marx? Like, was he one of the first people to like write in sort of an economic lens, or like I really don't know anything about the history of economics, like going back that far.
Oh no, economics stretches back many centuries before. In fact, Aristotle talked about economics.
Oh, okay.
It comes from the word economikos, which is describing the household. That's where the root of the
Oh,
term
oh,
economics comes
okay.
from. But in Marx's time, you have to read Marx, where he talks about the Marxists who came before him, most notably David Ricardo, an English economist. So the science, and then also going to Adam Smith, who is probably one of the most famous of the early modern
Oh,
economists.
yeah, of course.
Yeah, The Wealth of Nations
The
and all
Wealth of
that.
Nations. Yeah, I read that. I didn't even. I guess that probably got published before Marx then, right?
Yeah,
When was that published?
that was the 18th century.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely before
Yeah,
Marx.
but Marx in
Yeah.
his writings, he talks about the economists that came before him and criticizes them. Okay.
Okay, so he criticized like Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations
Adam
and
Smith,
other.
David
Okay.
Ricardo, a handful of them. I can't think
Oh,
of them
okay.
off the top of my head. All right. So use value can easily be understood, so Marx says, but he insists that exchange value is a puzzling phenomenon and relative exchange values need to be explained. Why does a quantity of one commodity exchange for a given quantity of another commodity? His explanation is in terms of the labor input required to produce the commodity, or rather, the socially necessary labor, which is labor exerted at the average level of intensity and productivity for that branch of activity within the economy. Thus, the labor theory of value, this is another core Marxist term, asserts that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Okay, let me read this again. Thus, the labor theory of value asserts that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. So in the case of a commodity, let's look at the t-shirt. T-shirt doesn't require a whole lot of socially necessary labor or intensity to make it, particularly if you have a machine to do it. If you did it by hand, that's a different story. Compare a shirt to a house. Okay, house takes a lot of time. House takes a lot of labor, more than one person, to produce it. So therefore, a house is much more valuable than a t-shirt is.
So the like the monetary value of a product is determined by the number of hours of labor it takes to make that.
Yes, socially
Okay.
necessary time. And I would caution against using the term of product. We're talking about
Okay.
commodities here. Commodities are something that is basically created for exchange in a market. Okay. So if you produce your own stuff, like you grow your own food and you consume it, that's not a commodity. But if you grow the food to take it to a farmer's market and people will pay for it, then it becomes a commodity.
Oh, so a commodity is something that you make to sell something else, but a product could be considered something for yourself as well?
Right. A commodity is something that's bought and sold.
Oh, okay.
Now, you can produce, in the case of growing your own vegetables, you can have a crop, say of corn. A certain percentage of it you consume, and the rest of it you can sell as a commodity for money, we'll say, in which you could use to purchase other vegetables, to produce other things that you need, like clothing, pay your rent, invest in farm machines so you can increase your production, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, at least in particular in today's, in the way today's economics work, it's way more complex than that. The price of a good is determined by the number of labor hours it takes to produce it, because there, especially in like a globalized economy, there are trade tariffs and all those sorts of things.
Right. However, also in the case of certain kinds of commodities, like the t-shirt. Okay, t-shirts are really cheap.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
You can go to Walmart, for example, get a brand new t-shirt that's a solid color for about $6 to $7 American.
Yeah.
Okay. It's really cheap. If you go to a consignment shop, you get it for $3 because it's slightly worn. Okay, it's not brand new. Now you could go to a rock concert and pay 20, 25, even $30 for that t-shirt. Why? It's because its value has been raised because of like a logo on it. It's a certain kind of branded logo, and people will pay money for it. Okay. I would not
Or
pay
they're
20 to
even
30.
or they're even like shirts that you can only get at that concert. Like I've done that before. I bought rather t-shirts at concerts that I've gone to, and they almost always on the back say like AC/DC Summer Tour 2009 or something like that.
Yeah. It's a licensed product.
Yeah.
Is what it is. Now, also in the case of a shirt, there are certain shirts that are made with a high quality cotton, or there's silk shirts with a print, and so on. And those would be more expensive than your average Walmart t-shirt. Okay. But even the best silk shirt, the amount of labor and time that it goes in to produce it is not on the same footing as a house.
Yeah.
Therefore, a house is much more valuable, much more expensive even than a shirt is.
Do you think maybe there's like some super rich celebrity who's bought like a $10,000 t-shirt or something like that, if it exists?
Sure, and that's a separate discussion about luxury items. Okay,
Yeah.
It's a commodity that far exceeds what its use value is, but its exchange value is high because people will pay that. I would never pay $10,000 for a t-shirt. No way.
Yeah. I simply can't even afford to do that.
No, I can afford to do that, but that would really be stupid because of so many other things that I could spend $10,000 on.
Yeah. Well, even if I had $100,000 to spend, I wouldn't spend that on a t-shirt.
No, and that's your choice. That's your choice. Okay, so that's all the labor theory of value. Continuing, the first stage is to argue that if two objects can be compared in the sense of being put on either side of an equal sign, then there must be a third thing of identical magnitude in both of them, to which they are both reducible. Let me read this again. The first stage is to argue that if two objects can be compared in the sense of being put on either side of an equal sign, then there must be a third thing of identical magnitude in both of them, to which they are both reducible. As commodities can be exchanged against each other, there must, Marx argues, be a third thing that they have in common. This then motivates the second stage, which is a search for the appropriate third thing, which is labor, in Marx's view, as the only plausible common element. Both steps of the argument, of course, highly contestable. So in other words, if you're putting a shirt and comparing it to a house, the use value is different, the exchange value is different, but there is something that is common between the two, and that is labor. Somebody produced the shirt. Somebody, or a group of somebodies, more likely, produced the house.
Is it that labor itself is the commonality between that, or is it that specifically the hours of labor it takes to make that commodity are the same as well?
No, it's labor in general, because labor is involved in producing either of those. Because, I mean, stop and think about it. Anything that you, Andrew, produce involves labor, even if it is cognitive labor, which is a separate issue. We're only talking about physical things here. Okay?
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Now remember, this is in Capital that Marx is talking about this. Any Marxist criticism you've heard, do they ever talk about this?
No.
Okay. That's my point. So continuing. Capitalism is distinctive, Marx argues, in that it involves not merely the exchange of commodities. Barter is an exchange of commodities too, but the advancement of capital in the form of money with the purpose of generating profit through the purchase of commodities and their transformation into other commodities, which can command a higher price and thus yield a profit. Okay, so let's go back to Economics 101. Capital is anything that you use. Most people think that it's money, but capital is anything that you use to begin an enterprise, to generate something with the purpose of generating a profit.
Right.
Now, again, lots of people think of capital as the form of money. That's the most common, financial capital. There are other forms of capital too. Emotional capital, or they sometimes use these words, emotional capital, the store of your emotions, your feelings, your desires, motivation, what have you, that you have within you to produce something or to accomplish something. If you're high in emotional capital, you can do a lot more than you are if you're low in emotional capital. Okay?
It also can become a problem too, I'm sure, if you have so much emotional capital that it overwhelms you or something like that.
Sure. That too. Another form of capital is social capital, your networks. Okay? There's only so much that you can do as an individual. Only so many hours in the day, only so much energy that you have based on your experience and your skills and so on and so forth. So with social capital is you can call on somebody else or some other people to help you in accomplishing a goal, creating an enterprise, we'll say.
I can see here where people don't like Marx because it's like against the idea of individualism, even if it's really mildly so.
Yeah, anybody who says that, in contemporary, I would say Anglo society, there's this fetishization of the entrepreneur, the lone entrepreneur.
I was just watching a video about that yesterday.
Yeah, that can create something, and they were so far-reaching and blah blah blah, horseshit.
Yeah,
they had social capital that enabled them to go a certain direction. Now, of course, they still had to work by the sweat of their brow to get where they are today. I mean, look at Bill Gates when he started Microsoft, for example. Microsoft's been around since 1975, believe it or not. But it really started to take off sometime in the early 90s with personal computers had introduced in the 1980s, and then Windows then became the software to run the PC versus Apple. Okay. But Bill Gates didn't do it alone.
Yeah.
As he used his father to help him negotiate with IBM, the licensing, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, you can read all about Bill Gates' bio. Same thing with Steve Jobs, same thing with Elon Musk, same thing with whoever the titans of industry, capitalism are right now. They have a high degree of social capital as well, not just monetary capital. But the
Yeah.
point is, capital is what the store is that enables you to do something in terms of generating a profit. Now, in the terms of financial capital, you want to increase your financial profit. In the terms of social capital, you might want to increase your social networks, or the return on the investment that you give in another person, and they would do something in turn for you. Okay,
Yeah.
this
I
is what
think it,
profit. This is what profit is.
I think it's important to underscore that idea of we talk about that in mixed mental arts, the idea of the genius myth, how
Yes.
there's this one person who's just so much smarter than everyone else. They're like godlike, so they can figure out something that no one else can figure out. But
Mm-hmm.
like you were pointing to with Steve Jobs and or not Steve Jobs, sorry, Bill Gates. And I was watching a video about this about Steve Jobs the other day. Like Steve Jobs, for example, he was the leader of this company, but he sort of like told people what to do, and all of the ingredients that went into the iPhone had already been invented before. So
Yes.
he was the one who made the decisions, and he was the leader of the company. So
Mm-hmm.
people see that public figure, like you were talking about in terms of social capital. So they
Right.
see like this one person as being solely responsible, or at least primarily responsible for this, when it was a team effort. It's like the way that I'm understanding this part is that it's the idea that it takes, like, we're all individuals, but we work together to create things too. It's a more nuanced approach. It's not like a collectivist approach, but it's not an individualist approach either.
Right. Not to mention that individuals make up the market, who are the consumers of the product. Because Steve Jobs, you point out something interesting, is that the technologies that go into the iPhone or in the smartphone in general had already existed for decades before. Telephony, microprocessing, touchscreens,
Yeah.
all these had existed before, and you're just synthesizing them, putting all into one device, which people just had to have. Now, when the iPhone came out, people could have said, just like they did with PCs back in the day, well, who the hell's going to use that?
Yeah.
And they could have just died on the vine. Fortunately,
Yeah.
it didn't, or unfortunately, it didn't, depending on how you look at it.
I think it's
But
both fortunately and unfortunately.
yeah, but we won't get into that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could point to that as a micro example of it's it's a give and take. There are upsides and there are downsides. So as much as people like to trumpet capitalism, it does have its dirty, dark downsides
Hmm.
that some people just want to ignore because they're only looking at the bounty. Hey, look at the choice. Look at all these consumer products. Hey, I can fly across the ocean for $45. What's not to like? Type of thing. All
And
right. Well,
capitalism is pulling more people out of poverty than ever before in history.
which is true.
Yeah.
But all is not as it seems necessarily. But we'll get into that. All right. So continuing, Marx claims that no previous theorist has been able adequately to explain how capitalism as a whole can make a profit. So just for clarification, a profit is what you do. Now, I like the way David Harvey explains this, is that the capitalist starts with a certain amount of money at the beginning of the day. And through his activities, he hopes to achieve one state, one prime state and one secondary state. The prime state is he makes a profit. So if he starts with $100, he ends the day with $150, he's made a $50 profit. Follow
Okay.
me?
Yeah.
Now, the secondary would be you break even. You started the day with $100, you made $100 at the end of the day. Not preferable to making a profit, but it's better than ending up with less money than you did at the beginning of the day. And anybody who's ever run a business or anybody who's ever um, kept tabs in a business, you don't make a profit, you're not going to be in business for very long.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. All right. So Marx's own solution relies on the idea of exploitation of the worker. In setting up the conditions of production, the capitalist purchases the worker's labor power, his ability to labor for the day. So the capitalist is the one that puts up the money and the resources, but he doesn't labor. The worker labors, And so since the capitalist cannot do the labor himself, he could try to do it himself and maybe make a profit, but that's really not sustainable on a large scale. So instead, you purchase the worker's labor power with a wage. Okay. If I'm a capitalist, I want to hire you. You have some kind of skill that I don't have. Andrew, I'll tell you what, I'm going to pay you $50 for the day. Would you do it? You say yes. And then the next day, and then the next day, and the next day. Okay, I'm purchasing your labor power for a wage.
Okay.
Okay. The cost of this commodity is determined in the same way as the cost of every other. That is, in terms of the amount of socially necessary labor power required to produce it. In this case, the value of a day's labor power is the value of the commodities necessary to keep the worker alive for a day. Let me read this again. In this case, the value of a day's labor power is the value of the commodities necessary to keep the worker alive for a day. Because I don't want you to die.
Right.
Okay, suppose that such commodities take 4 hours to produce. Thus, the first 4 hours of the working day is spent on producing value equivalent to the value of the wages the worker will be paid. This is known as necessary labor. Any work the worker does above this is known as surplus labor, producing surplus value for the capitalist. Surplus value, according to Marx, is the source of all profit. Okay, so if I were doing this myself and I'm starting at $100 for the day, then whatever I make above that, 150, 160, 200, whatever it is surplus for me. I've made a profit.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I can take that money and plow it back into operating the business and purchasing other equipment to increase my production and so on and so forth. Okay, you see this all the time in how capitalist industries work.
Right.
But when we're talking about the worker, all right, so the worker, in this example here, the first 4 hours, and then it's the break-even point. And then anything else, that's the necessary labor to produce whatever the commodity is. If it takes 4 hours to produce a t-shirt, it takes 4 hours to produce a t-shirt.
Okay.
So then anything afterwards is the surplus labor that the capitalist captures. So me as the worker working more than what it takes to produce the t-shirt, the capitalist owns. I don't own that.
So if you work an 8-hour day, the capitalist owns that second 4 hours.
Correct. Again, depending on how long it will take to produce the commodity. Now, we're going to see this a little bit later on, I think we will, is that what the capitalist is going to try to do with the exploitation of the worker is trying to squeeze more production out of that worker and capturing more surplus labor.
Okay.
Okay. So if it takes you 4 hours to produce the t-shirt, I, as the capitalist, want to try to get that down as low as possible. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If I can get you, if a week later I can get you down to 3 hours, I'm going to do that. If a month from now I can get you down to 1 hour, I can do that. Or why is that? It's because when you no longer it takes 4 hours to produce a t-shirt, it takes 1 hour. So with 1 hour labor, then you can produce 4 t-shirts in 4 hours versus 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then anything past that, again, is surplus labor that I am capturing. Because what I'm trying to do, they're talking about this all the time with exploitation, is the capitalist is exploiting the worker to be as productive as possible and pay them as little as possible.
Okay.
Okay. This is a whole, this we're still talking about this almost 150 years later from Marx.
Pay them as little as possible so they can get more profit.
Right, so they can get more profit. And even with technology, is you eliminate the worker entirely and you have a machine do it.
Right.
Why? It's because the machine doesn't need to take a break, doesn't require to be fed, doesn't require to be housed, doesn't require medical insurance or anything like that. And the machine can just produce, the machine, the worker produced, if I could get the worker down to 1 hour to make a t-shirt, the machine could probably make 100 in an hour.
Yeah.
That's really surpassing production.
I was thinking the other day about how, if at some point in the future it's possible that literally all jobs could be replaced by robots, then maybe I mean, I'm certainly no expert on this. I've just heard people talk about the idea of like a universal basic income, especially if that sort of thing happens to be the case, then maybe like those companies could just get profits from the government and or I mean like they could fund the government, like the government could tax them, and then that could create some sort of universal basic income, and then people could just work if they wanted to, and people could use some of their money to buy those products if they want to. I think I heard my friend Ladin Jerechek, who's been on here before, talk about that too. He's knows more about these topics than I do.
Yeah, people are starting to talk more about UBI. In fact, Andrew Yang, one of the
Yeah, I like him.
Democratic candidates, is probably the only one of the Democratic candidates that is talking about automation, job loss, UBI. There's some problems with it, but we're not going to get into
Yeah,
that now.
yeah.
Okay. So continuing, Marxist analysis, labor power is the only commodity which can produce more value than it is worth. And for this reason, it is known as variable capital. It's not fixed. Okay. You can produce more, you can produce less, changes over time. Other commodities simply pass their value on to the finished commodities, but do not create any extra value. They are known as constant capital. Profit, then, is the result of the labor performed by the worker beyond that necessary to create the value of his or her wages. And this is the surplus value theory of profit, which there are criticisms of, but this is it in a nutshell. Okay, so continuing, I won't go too much into this. It appears to follow from this analysis that as industry becomes more mechanized, using more constant capital and less variable capital, the rate of profit ought to fall, for as proportion, less capital would be advanced on labor, and only labor can create value. In Capital Volume 3, Marx does indeed make the prediction that the rate of profit will fall over time, and this is one of the factors which leads to the downfall of capitalism. So in other words, with constant capital and less variable capital, as the capitalist, I'm trying to get as much as I can out of my workers, and workers are necessary labor. If I can, I prefer not to deal with them. Okay. And how I do so is I introduce machines. This was already happening in Marx's time. Why? Because it's not variable capital, it is constant capital. The machine has a certain amount of output. It requires a lot less maintenance than a human worker would.
Doesn't need to
But
sleep or eat.
nope, no potty breaks or anything like that. But the problem is, over time, the rate of profit falls. Okay, and that's not something that a capitalist wants to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
So
there's a whole discussion of the falling rate of profit.
Yeah, I mean, so isn't the I'm a little confused as to why the rate of profit eventually starts to fall if if more and more machines are replacing jobs. It seems to be based on the labor theory of value, but wouldn't there just be a new theory of value if something like that continues to happen, or would it like bankrupt the companies before that sort of thing happens?
Well, right, there's a problem with the labor failure value. Okay, there's lots of criticism that Marxist and Marxist commentators have made about the labor theory. Again, we're just looking at Marx's core ideas. I'm a little bit fuzzy on this because it's been some time since I really got into this. I probably should again. Is that I think the reason why the rate of profit falls is because, again, this is one of those contradictions in capitalism, where you don't want the worker because the worker is an expense. The machine is an expense, but far less of an expense than the worker is. And the machine can be more productive than the worker is. Plus, it doesn't fight back. It doesn't go on strike, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But the more productive you become, prices fall. And so you can't charge as much.
Oh, okay.
So let's look at the case of the t-shirt. If you handcrafted a t-shirt, I kind of hate to use that term. If you handcrafted a t-shirt, you put a lot of time into it. You could sell it for a high price because it's like, look, This is not a mass-produced t-shirt. I put a lot of work into this. It's of the finest silk, hand-stitched, and so on and so forth. So you can command a higher price and somebody would pay for that. You can charge $100 for it. If it's mass-produced, it's a common commodity. And lots of your competitors are producing t-shirts. So if you can't compete on quality, then you have to compete on price. My t-shirt is cheaper than the other guys. Okay.
Okay.
And so if the price is cheaper, then your profit is going to be smaller because you just can't charge as much.
And you can't just endlessly sell more and more of the same product unless the population keeps endlessly growing.
That's right. There has to be growth. So, another problem that you reach with capitalism is overproduction, saturation of the market. If you produce 10,000 t-shirts, for example, with the prediction that the population of a town is going to increase from 5,000 to 10,000 in the space of 2 years, but it doesn't, then you've just produced way more t-shirts than anybody is going to use, even if they purchase more than one. Not everybody's going to buy 5 t-shirts or 10 t-shirts, whatever it is. Okay. So then you're left with a problem of excess capacity, which you're going to slash a discount, sell it for $1 or so, but even then you might not be able to move it. So because you've slashed the price, and if you're stuck with the merchandise because nobody buys it, your rate of profit falls because that's going to be an expense that you got to eat.
So does something like inflation sort of balance this?
It could, but inflation is more of that's more in finance.
Okay.
We're talking about production of physical goods, physical commodities here. Okay. So this is, I think, the explanation of the falling rate of profit. I could be wrong. Again, it's been a while since I looked at this. Okay. Let's go ahead and finish this paragraph, and then we'll get on to Deleuze. Okay, so a further consequence of this analysis is a difficulty for the theory that Marx did recognize and tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to meet also in Capital Volume 3. It follows from the analysis so far that labor-intensive industries ought to have a higher rate of profit than those which use less labor. So, for example, building houses is a much more labor-intensive industry than making t-shirts. Not only is this empirically false, it is theoretically unacceptable. Accordingly, Marx argued that in real economic life, prices vary in a systematic way from values. Providing them okay, so before I get on, prices vary in a systematic way from values. Okay, so in the case of the t-shirt, certain people might value a Walmart t-shirt more importantly than other people. For example, people in the third world who really have a hard time with clothing would gladly take a mass-produced t-shirt because it does the job, it kind of looks nice, and it's made a hell of a lot better than somebody would by hand.
Yeah.
Okay. So they value it more than people like us who live in North America, where just like it's a cheap t-shirt, and I'm not paying $100 for a Walmart t-shirt.
Right.
Okay. Simply because of the fact that it's a mass-produced commodity. So this is the point about the difference in prices versus values. Just because something is highly valued doesn't mean that the price is equal to it, because people might not pay the price. You're going to charge that much for that t-shirt? I don't think so. So then you're going to have to drop it until it gets to the point where somebody says, this t-shirt is only worth X amount of dollars because I value it differently.
Right. Yeah. These are like some of the factors I was sort of thinking about before in terms of how economics is a lot more complex than the way we were talking about it first.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay. So continuing, providing the mathematics to explain this is known as the transformation problem, and Marx's own attempt suffers from technical difficulties. Although there are known techniques for solving this problem now, albeit with unwelcome side consequences, we should recall that the labor theory of value was initially motivated as an intuitively plausible theory of price. But when the connection between price and value is rendered as indirect as it is in the final theory, the intuitive motivation of the theory drains away. A further objection is that Marx's assertion that only labor can create surplus value is unsupported by the argument or analysis, and can be argued to be merely an artifact of the nature of his presentation. Any commodity can be picked to play a similar role. Consequently, with equal justification, one could set out a corn theory of value, arguing that corn has the unique power of creating more value than it costs. Formally, this would be identical to the labor theory of value. Nevertheless, the claims that somehow labor is responsible for the creation of value and that profit is the consequence of exploitation remain intuitively powerful, even if they are difficult to establish in detail. Okay. So the upshot of this is that there are some flaws with Marxist theory. Okay, because again, he is equating profit as a consequence of exploitation. Where that might not necessarily be the case, because particularly in today's day and age, in the past couple of decades, with financial jiggering, you can create a lot more value because of financial games and manipulation than you'd ever could with production.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, but we won't get into that. All right, so I think this is sufficient for what we're going to do with Deleuze and Guattari and what they had to say about Marx and Marxism. Okay. Makes sense so far. Again, has any critic of Marxism ever covered any of this that you've heard?
Not that I've heard, no.
Now, some people have, like Tom Woods, the libertarian, has done this because he
actually,
approaches it from the
Austrian
Austrian theory as a critique of Marxist economics.
I might have heard Tom Woods offer those criticisms before then, and I just don't remember it because I do listen to his show occasionally.
Yeah, go back to his earlier podcast from a few years ago. He gets more into explaining Austrian theory.
Okay.
So with that out of the way, let's shift gears and let's go ahead to the Deleuze book. Okay. So we are looking at essay number 8. This is on page 147 for those that have the book. Karl Marx by Eugene Holland, who is an emeritus professor at Ohio State, I just learned. Okay. So on the first page, I'm going to quote Holland here. First, he says, quote, "What Marx admired of production and the which offered humankind the historical prospect of overcoming necessity and realizing freedom." Okay, let me read that again. What Marx admired most about capitalism was its socialization of production relations and the attendant development of human productive forces, which offered humankind the historical prospect of overcoming necessity and realizing freedom. So in other words, instead of you as the individual really scratching out a living, limited by what you could do, you band together with other people, you increase your production, particularly through a division of labor. Somebody farms, somebody hunts, somebody processes the food, somebody builds your huts, and so on and so forth. That's a socialization of production. All productive forces collectively. You overcome necessity. You're not scratching out a living necessarily. And then you have realized more freedom than you have before.
Collectivizing everything.
Collectivizing everything, yes. So even Holland says here.
This is where people like critics talk about how with collectivized farms in Stalin's Russia, for example, farmers would just start like going over the same paths in the same crops over and over again so they could do more labor.
That's right. So the problem with collectivization was, say, a village, a farming village, was producing products that was going to be distributed all over the Soviet Union or the communist state, whichever it was. In a sense, it's almost like a capitalist type of production because you have a certain plot in your cornfields, we'll say, for your consumption, but the rest of it you don't sell for a product. The rest of it, the communist state takes that excess production and then distributes it amongst everybody.
Oh yeah, this is like you mentioning how that's a capitalist sort of thing reminds me of way back when we were talking about Zygmunt Bauman and him saying that communism is modernism on steroids.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, but notice the distinction here.
Yeah.
In a capitalist society, you would take the surplus and you would sell it. In a communist society with farming collectivization, any of your excess was taken by the state and distributed.
Right.
You didn't get anything for it. You got to keep what was your little plot of corn
So
for your own consumption.
You don't get any profit from your labor. That's given to the government.
Right. In a communist system, there's no profit.
Right.
Capitalist system, there is.
Right.
Some would argue that there really isn't that much profit, but no, that's a separate discussion.
Right.
All right. So what Deleuze admires most about capitalism is the ways in which the socialization of production, the development of productive forces, and the spread of the market actively promote difference. We're back to difference again. By constantly decoding representation and continually expanding the division of labor, capital constitutes an immensely powerful difference engine. This is one word, a difference engine.
What's that mean?
We'll get to that. In relation to
wait, first of all, throughout this series, we've talked about how whatever philosopher Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, they're either an ally or an enemy. So is Marx an ally or an enemy?
I'd say he is somewhere in the middle, because Marxism is important for French intellectual life in the 1960s, around the time that Deleuze and Guattari got together.
Right.
But just like other critics have said, Marx falls short in some respects.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but do I remember that Deleuze was a Marxist?
He was a Marxist, yes.
Okay.
As was Guattari.
Okay.
Lots of French intellectuals at the time were Marxists.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me go over this again. By constantly decoding representation and continually expanding the division of labor, capital constitutes an immensely powerful difference engine. In relation to two of the other difference engines constituting human being, the evolution of biological life and the expression of linguistic sense, the capitalist difference engine is important for Deleuze because it accelerates processes of differentiation already active in the living body and in expressive language, by respectively grafting labor diversification and specialization onto humans' already extremely adaptable biological makeup, and by subjecting any and all linguistic and cultural representations to market decoding.
Okay.
So let's unpack this a bit. Difference engines constituting the human being. The evolution of biological life. Okay. So as we see in the diversification of species, humans, other animals, fish, and so on. This is difference.
Yeah.
Okay. And the expression of linguistic sense. Many different languages, dialects within the same language, spelling differences, and so on. Difference already exists within linguistic sense. So already we have two difference engines. Biological life, linguistic sense. The capitalist difference engine is important because it accelerates processes of differentiation already active in the living body and in expressive language. By respectively grafting labor diversification, the division of labor. You do this, I do this, she does this, he does this, and so on. And specialization, one knows how to bake bread, another one knows how to build a house, another one knows how to work the forge, and so on. Onto humans is already extremely adaptable biological makeup, and by subjecting any and all linguistic and cultural representations to market decoding. So in other words, things are subsumed within a market, and that's how you use it to explain things. You do this, I purchase your labor for this. I have this, you have this, let's exchange. Okay, this is a market understanding.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so then continuing on the next page. Okay. The function of political philosophy, this is Holland still, the function of political philosophy is to create new concepts in response to ever-changing situations. Let me read that again. The function of political philosophy is to create new concepts in response to ever-changing situations. Concept creation involves, for one thing, selectively borrowing concepts or elements of concepts from previous philosophies while rejecting other concepts or elements, as Deleuze does with respect to Marxism. So in other words, you pick and choose certain things from Marxism. You don't swallow it whole or
That
adopt it
reminds me
wholesale.
of how pragmatists like William James talk about how philosophy is historical, and you draw on the history of it and change it as it goes along.
Yes, but that also implies that there's an organic growth in the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay. Not so much the case with Deleuze, because remember what he's doing in his readings, his selective readings of the previous philosophers. He takes certain concepts from them and discards others.
Right.
So he's doing the same thing with Marxism.
It makes sense. He's
Okay.
following like the rule of mixed mental arts: take what is useful, ignore what is not, and make it uniquely your own.
Bingo. If only he had known the term back then. In fact, you could say that Deleuze is one of the original mixed mental arts artists.
I would
Okay.
say so.
So Holland continues, but more important, concept creation involves responding to problems arising outside of philosophy by adapting selected concepts and elements to new situations. Existence poses problems, and the task of political philosophy is to formulate such problems as productively as possible in concepts so as to improve our capacity to address them in the actual world. Okay, so in other words, you pick and choose what is useful, discard what is not useful. You take these concepts and you use them as a framework to address the problems in the ever-changing situations that result, and this is political philosophy.
So political philosophy should be adaptive, basically.
Should be adaptive, yes.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it doesn't seem to be adaptive.
No. Yeah. That's
All right.
for sure.
All right. So continuing on. Okay, next page. Page 149. Holland continues. In terms very different from the base superstructure model familiar from orthodox Marxism, Deleuze poses the relation of the economic instance to social reality in terms of virtual problems and actual solutions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about base and superstructure. Let's look this up. All right. So reading from Wikipedia. In Marxist theory, capitalist society consists of two parts, the base and the superstructure. The base comprises the forces and relations of production. For example, employer-employee work conditions, the technical division of labor, and property relations, into which people enter to produce the necessities and amenities of life. The base determines society's other relationships and ideas to comprise its superstructure, including its culture, institutions, power, political structures, roles, rituals, and state. While the relation of the two parts is not strictly unidirectional, meaning going from one to the other, as the superstructure often affects the base, the influence of the base is predominant. Marx and Engels warned against such economic determinism. Okay. That's base and superstructure. So, reading, Deleuze poses the relation of the economic instance to social reality in terms of virtual problems and actual solutions. So remember, we've talked about virtuality before in the previous essays. The virtual means that it exists, but it doesn't actually exist.
So it's like something theoretical.
Something theoretical, or that it has a certain reality that is not physical.
Like it could be, were we talking about examples of like fictional characters or like something like a unicorn or something like that too?
Right. Fictional characters could be one example, but also when you talk about social relations. Okay, so some philosophers will talk about social reality.
Right.
Okay. Can you point to something and say that's social reality? No. Can you take it like Plato and fashion it into something material? No. But when you dig down deep enough, one would assert that yes, there is such a thing as social reality.
Yeah.
The U.S. has a certain social reality, which is different from state to state and region to region. Same thing in Canada. It's a different kind of social reality.
Yeah.
Okay. It exists. It's part of reality. Is it part of physical reality? Does it actually exist? No, but one would say that it does, and this is where the virtual comes in.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like like the labor theory of value, or like the whole way that economics is run is sort of like virtual too.
Yes, it is virtual.
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing, Holland says, at the most abstract level, and given a multitude of differences as a starting point, for example, differences of gender, age, ability, skill, etc., the fundamental social problem is how to organize social relations so as to maximize the positive potential of the social multiplicity thereby created. Let me read this again. At the most abstract level, and given multitude of differences as a starting point, the fundamental social problem is how to organize social relations so as to maximize the positive potential of the social multiplicity thereby created. So, in other words, given that you all have all kinds of different elements within a social body, how does one organize this so that it maximizes positivity potential that's been created? How do you
Okay.
create, for example, the best, positive, most productive society that you can, given the multitude of differences?
Okay.
Because there's no homogeneity here. Probably would be far easier to do that if you had a homogeneous society, but that's not the case.
Right.
Even if, something I want to point out, even if everybody was white and you're getting rid of race, you're still going to have differences because of gender, males and females, and the differences in their strengths and weaknesses, older, younger people, their abilities, skills, and so on. So don't even go there with race. Even if you were to eliminate race and it's just one race, you're still going to have these multitude of differences. And you
Yeah.
still have to figure out how are you going to maximize, how are you going to put this together, maximize its positive productive forces.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. In more recognizably Marxist terms, the basic social problem is how to organize social relations so as to maximize the enhancement of production and consumption arising from the technical and social division of labor, while minimizing the risks arising from a political division of labor, conducive to gross inequalities of wealth and power, and to exploitation, oppression, and repression. Okay, let's go back to what we had said before about Marx. Marx had some positive things to say about capitalism, but he's often tarred as the enemy of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's unfair, but so be it. I'm not the other critics. What Marx was concerned about, being a humanist, was what does one do about social organization? Because with capitalism, capitalism gives us all these goodies, but you have gross inequalities of wealth that results. You have exploitation of workers, oppression, if the workers get out of line, and repression. Repression of workers and repressions of certain ways of thinking, motivations. Some people, they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to participate in capitalist society. What do you deal with them? I mean, are you going to try to subsume them within the capitalist society? Are you going to leave them go? If you don't want to leave them go and ignore them, if they're becoming a problem, what do you do with them? Can you eliminate them? So on and so forth. All of these arise from the capitalist society.
Mm-hmm.
This is the basic social problem. What do you do in a capitalist society where you maximize production and consumption? Because that's the name of the game with capitalism, while minimizing all the risks that are involved with it. And we still haven't figured that out to this day.
Yeah. And it's so like it's complex, and there are pros and cons to it.
Sure. All right. So let's move on to page 150. Holland says, so let's take a moment to describe the mode of production, which is another fundamental Marxist concept. The mode of production, okay, producing something, particularly a commodity. The mode of production could be by hand. The mode of production could be by machine. The mode of production could be by a group of people utilizing machines. The mode of production, particularly in Marx's time with industrial capitalism, is a large-scale factory model, lots of people involved, capital intensive, machines are involved, as are workers. Okay, these are the modes of production. In the artisanal society, the mode of production was the individual. You made what you needed based on your skill. If you couldn't do certain things, then you socialized that production to your tribe, your village, parts of the city, and whatever it was.
Right.
But in capitalism, because the capitalist owns the mode of production, the workers are alienated from this.
Right.
Okay? Make sense now?
Yeah.
Okay. So given that the mode of production in general is now defined as a virtual structure, posing fundamentally economic problems, it's a virtual structure, a mode of production, because you can point to a factory and you say, T-shirts are made in this factory. But what is a factory, if not a building and a collection of individuals and machines that reside in that building?
Right.
You don't want to fall into a category mistake and say the building is the factory.
Right.
Or the workers are the factory, or the foreman are the factory, or the owner of the building is the factory. Okay. This is where it becomes like a virtual structure. Yes, we understand by mode of production, this is what we're talking about, virtually speaking.
Okay.
Okay. Is now defined as a virtual structure posing fundamentally economic problems. Deleuze and Guattari delineate three historical solutions to these problems, which they call coding in the savage mode of production. Okay. Overcoding in the barbarian mode of production, which is taking by force. And axiomatization in the civilized or capitalist mode of production. Axiomatization, that's a tough one. Axiomatization is using axioms, rules, by which you conduct or govern a certain way of producing.
Okay.
Okay? Significantly, these solutions involve ways of managing debt, for whereas Marx considers production to be primary, Deleuze and Guattari, drawing here more on Nietzsche than Marx, instead consider debt to be the primary element in any actual social formation.
That's what Nietzsche said about debt?
Well, he was drawing on Nietzsche because of, I guess, productive forces, but this is this is also Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche from Nietzschean philosophy.
I don't recall reading anything that Nietzsche said about economics, but I've only read like one or two books by him.
Yeah, so it's buried in there somewhere. Don't have time to get into that now. So Marx considers production to be primary, but Deleuze and Guattari say it's debt. Okay, against the grain of Marx's dialectical derivation of surplus from production and of finance capital from industrial capital, their view gives finance capital priority over industrial capital. Okay, so remember our earlier discussion about capital. Industrial capital is material production. Financial capital is more financial trickery in its worst cases, but finance is also banking.
Right.
To acquire capital for me to do whatever it is I want to do, like build a factory to make T-shirts, there's many different ways I can get that financial capital. Number one is it's my own money. But where did I get that? Did I work for it? It's possible, but I'm certainly not going to work. I certainly am not going to live long enough to earn the kind of money it would take to build a factory. There were some capitalists in the day who inherited their money. You know, they were multimillionaires by the time they were born. So they had a lot of money at their disposal, financial capital, to do what they wanted to do from an industrial perspective.
Without
There's
earning
also,
it through any labor.
right, there's also investors. So lots of well-heeled individuals invest their money into an enterprise because they expect to get a return on their investment.
Mm-hmm.
Just look at Silicon Valley, venture
Angel
capitalists,
investors. Yeah.
all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are many different ways that you can get financial capital. But the point here is that with Deleuze and Guattari, they prioritize finance over industrial capital. And with finance involves debt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So continuing, how does society manage the problems of economics? By organizing a system of debt relations, driving production and exchange, a patchwork of finite and temporary debts in the case of savagery, an infinite debt owed to the despot, head priest, or king in barbarism, and equally infinite debt owed to capital and capitalism. These solutions may be false, illusory, or, quote, ideological, but they are nonetheless effective in organizing production and exchange relations. Okay. So what they're saying here with debt is, I agree through this understanding of finance to enable you to do something because I'm giving you money. That's one way to look at it. So if you want to do X, Y, and Z, I say, all right, Andrew, I'm going to give you $100,000 to do it. I've invested in you. You have the financial capital to purchase your equipment, purchase patents, or file patents in the case of intellectual property of something that you've created, hire lawyers to make sure you don't get sued, and to hire workers. Okay.
Right.
But you have a debt to me because I have given you the money.
Right.
Okay. So you see where debt becomes is prioritized over production. You're producing whatever it is, but you owe a debt to me because I've given you money.
In those sort of circumstances, don't the investors sometimes get a percentage of the company's profits or something like that?
Yes, because again, they want a return on what their investment is.
Right.
They might get a percentage of the company's profit. They might get so many shares in stock and ownership in the company, in which case that secures them the percentage of the profit.
Right.
They might get a certain part of the IP, intellectual property that's produced. That's all worked out in the initial contracts before they give them the money.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those are the debt relations. Now continuing. This is where it gets interesting. Perhaps an even more important transformation of the concept of mode of production than the position assigned to debt in relation to production is the redefinition of production itself proposed by Deleuze and Guattari. For production in general now includes libido as well as labor power. What they call, quote, production is the investment of human energy in any and all activity, whether psychical or physical or both. So just one note here. Libido doesn't necessarily mean the sex drive.
What does it mean?
It means psychical or physical energy that's invested in something.
Okay.
Okay. Libido, you could say, is desire in certain respect.
Okay.
So this is production. It's not just because, I mean, stop and think about it. If you as the individual, this is at the micro level, if you as the individual want to create a house as shelter, okay, you're doing it for a specific purpose. You don't feel like doing it, it's probably not going to get done. So you have no libido, you have no psychic, emotional, whatever you want to call investment is in building this house or shelter.
Right.
So this is, libido is, one could even say, essential to production.
Okay.
Now, sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, sure, producing the shelter, if you live a place where it's cold, you have a motivation to build that shelter. So your libido is still there. Maybe it's slightly under duress. It's because you're really not interested in producing it. You kind of have to because you'll freeze to death otherwise.
Right.
Okay. And it is distinctive of capitalism to have separated the two components of production, psychological and economic, from one another, with the emergence of economics as an actual social field in its own right, attended on the emergence and dominance of abstract labor in the capitalist mode of production, and with the segregation of reproduction in the nuclear family. So something we didn't cover before is reproduction. Capitalism produces, but the family reproduces.
Right. Going back to the original definition of economics, I think you said it was
Managing the household.
Yeah.
But it's also reproduction because workers die,
Right.
or they become infirm and then they die. So if you know, in the case of a capitalist, you don't want to squeeze your workers too much because they might all die on you, and then you're up shit creek without a paddle. So there's that. However, the point of this is also part of the, you could say, the capitalist ideology is to encourage families many of whom at the time might have been working all in the same place, as sticking together with the nuclear family, mother and father, with reproduction producing new workers and new consumers.
Oh, I never thought about that connection to the idea of the nuclear family before in terms of capitalism. That's interesting.
Yeah, because again, stop and think about it. Is within, we're speaking broadly here about capitalism, is capitalism produces, and consumption is very much tied up with it. If you have no consumers, what good are your products? You can consume them themselves, but if you're GM, for example, and you produce a car, how many cars do you need to get from point A to point B?
Got to have more kids so you can buy more cars.
Have more kids, yeah, you have more kids, but it's going to take time for those kids to reach 16 so they can actually drive those cars.
Yeah.
That engenders other problems. But the point is, yes, reproduction is in the nuclear family, not in capitalism mode is about production.
Right.
Okay. All right. So moving to the next page. Now, one note about the two volumes where Deleuze and Guattari talk about capitalism. The first is called Anti-Oedipus. The second, Capitalism and Schizophrenia.
Right.
Okay. Why is this important? Because, as Holland notes on the next page, page 152, not only did Deleuze and Guattari focus on Marx, but they also brought Freud into the picture.
Okay.
This is where you're starting to see this with the libido.
Going against, I'm assuming, I think we've talked about it a little bit before, about that anti-Oedipus is against the Freud's Oedipus complex.
Yes, that's a mention about the Oedipus complex. Now, they're saying anti-Oedipus because, yes, this is a criticism of Freud.
Okay.
But, as Holland says on 152, this is where we're now starting to focus on Jacques Lacan, okay, who is a Freudian and a structuralist, but who is not a 100% Cartesian Freudian. Yes, Zizek's, one of Zizek's prime influences.
Yeah.
Okay, so on page 152, Holland says, Lacan described the process whereby parental caregiving gives particular zones of the infinite body erotic value in terms of territorialization. Gotta love this word.
Oh, yeah. Deleuze talks about deterritorialization, right?
Territorialization and deterritorialization. Yes. But the plasticity of the human organism is such that any given territorialization of the body, any specific system of erogenous zones, which could be your genitals, back of the neck, whatever it is, can be deterritorialized and psychic energy reinvested or reterritorialized in a new system of organization. Drawing on this view, but importing a term from French playwright Antonin Artaud, Deleuze and Guattari called the locus and limit of psychosomatic deterritorialization the body without organs, or BWO. This is a core concept within those two volumes. The body without organs. It designates the moment when psychic energy is detached from fixed connection to any specific organ, sign, image, or thought. It's almost a free-floating psychic energy, and becomes free to invest other objects indiscriminately.
I find this part is confusing me, like a free-floating psychic energy.
Okay, so let's go. So they're taking the territorialization from Lacan, all right?
Okay.
So he's talking about erogenous zones. So you, as a parent, you have your infant, you massage the back of their neck, okay? They like that. One could say that's an erogenous zone, erotic, but not necessarily in the sexual respect.
Right.
It's a nice area that you simulate, and the infant responds to it positively. Rub the infant's tummy, play with its toes. Okay, so this is territorializing erotic value on the body.
You should make like relaxing tapes for children to play for for parents to play for their children to soothe them.
That's right. Now
Rub the infant's belly.
Now you're territorializing their belly. But you see what I'm getting at here with territorialization?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Then continuing, the plasticity of the human organism, that any given territorialization can be deterritorialized and psychic energy reinvested or reterritorialized in a new system or organization. So you rub the infant's belly, then when they're 1 year old, they don't like this anymore. So then you're moving towards scratching their back. Okay. So you have deterritorialized the belly, and then you reterritorialize to the back.
Okay.
Okay. This is a mouthful of. I mean, you understand the concept, but it's a strange term to use.
It'd be funny if people talk this way when they were having sex. I am territorializing your vagina. Now I'm going to deterritorialize.
That's right. Oh, I need to smoke a cigarette. I'm deterritorializing from the missionary position. I'm reterritorializing myself next to you. Yeah, that would make for a good porn film, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
All right. So then the point about the body without organs is psychic energy detached from any specific organ, sign, image, or object becomes free to invest other objects indiscriminately. So let's take something out of consumption. Okay, I take up smoking. This is where my psychic energy is invested. I derive pleasure from the act of smoking and from the cigarette. Okay, so that psychic energy is now attached to a cigarette and the act of smoking, a specific object. But I deterritorialize drifting from it. So the thing about the psychic energy is it is not a one-to-one relation. If I flick away the cigarette and I say I'm not smoking anymore, I don't lose my psychic energy. I can redirect it to something else, maybe weed, or maybe drinking too much coffee, or eating too many sweets, or whatever it is. Okay, I'm redirecting my psychic energy, and I can do that because of body without organs. It's not fixed to one particular thing. Follow me so far?
I'm still not. I still don't quite understand the image of the body without organs in terms of territorialization and deterritorialization.
Yeah, it's a tough one to visualize because you're just like, how can a body not have organs? Wouldn't it just be a hollow corpse? No, that's that's not what we're getting at here. It's a concept. Okay, so just run with this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Continuing, Holland says, just as libidinal energy can be detached or decathected, that's a Freudian term. A cathexis is when you are directing psychic energy, attaching it to something.
Okay.
Decathected. From one object and focused on another. So too can labor power be detached from one object. Fields and command land, in the classic case of the Enclosure Act cited by Marx, and refocused on another. Mechanical looms of the nascent textile industry. Again, this is in the 19th century in Marx's time. Indeed, capitalism becomes famous for constantly revolutionizing the means of production, as Marx says. Famous, that is, for constantly deterritorializing labor power and reterritorializing it on ever newer means of production and consumption as capitalism expands and intensifies in response to the falling rate of profit. Okay, so we talked before about the falling rate of profit. If you were a capitalist and you're making t-shirts, okay, according to Marx, there's going to be a time when your profit rates start to fall inexorably. There's really nothing that you can do to get them back up because the industry, as we had talked with that example before, the price falls and your profits fall because of mass production. Partially partially overproduction. Your competitors are doing the same thing. You know, Marx talks about the competitors. All capitalists are competing for one another for surplus value, which is why you have lots of beverage companies and clothing companies and so on. You know, there's all kinds of competitors. You don't have one monopoly necessarily doing that.
Right.
So this is an inexorable law, according to Marxist theory, the falling rate of profit. So what happens? The capitalist shifts direction to do something else. If you're making t-shirts, I mean, here's an excellent example within the past couple decades. Computers and commodity IT. You ever heard that term?
No, but it sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Okay. Perfect example for commodity IT is the price of laptops, desktops, and other mobile devices. Okay.
Okay.
You know how much a laptop computer cost about 20 years ago?
No.
A couple $1,000s.
Oh, okay.
Now, how much does a faster, better processing computer cost?
Like 1,000?
Not even a high-end one, probably 400 to 500 bucks.
This laptop that I'm talking on cost $300.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the laptop you're using now is more powerful than one that was out 20 years ago, and it's far cheaper.
Yeah.
Okay. That's commodity IT. And commodity IT meaning that it can be mass produced, and really doesn't matter if you have an Asus or Toshiba or Acer or Dell or whatever it is, okay? It's commodity IT. If it's got an Intel processor in it, it can do pretty much what you expect with some different bells and whistles for whatever the manufacturer is,
Right.
right? Some of the IT companies got away from commodity IT for precisely that reason. They just got rid of it, they spun it off, or they shoved it over to the side because they couldn't make as much money on that as they did 20, 25 years ago,
Right.
30 years ago. Instead, what did they do? They invested in things like software, or because I work in IT, cloud computing has been the big thing for the past 5 to 10 years. So this is deterritorializing and reterritorializing on a new means of production.
Right.
Okay. That's what that whole thing is. In the response to the falling rate of profit, capitalism shifts and it goes towards a new market. It could do something within the same market, or it could open up new markets, because this is where you're going to have increased rates of profit. But unfortunately, the inexorable law is that eventually you're going to reach a falling rate of profit. But this thing about territorializing and reterritorializing. Now, in the case of labor, for example, as a concrete example, near my hometown in Ohio, one of GM's plants, the Lordstown plant, which is a very important one that's been there for many decades, just recently closed. It was making the Chevy Cruze. You probably know this
Okay.
car. That was a serious blow to United Auto Workers in that part of the state. Why? Because that was a big plant and employed a lot of people. It was a major plant making a fairly well-selling car. But GM shifted because people didn't care that much about cruises and they were going back to SUVs. Okay. So GM is shifting its production away from one particular model to go towards other models, because this is where they're going to keep their existing profits and maybe increase their profits. But the people that work at the Lordstown plant, they're fucked.
Right.
Unfortunately. They have been, the plant has been, the production has been deterritorialized from there.
Right.
Okay. So you all see how this works?
Yeah.
This is all capitalism at work. Territorialization, reterritorialization, chasing other rates of profit because the profits that exist because of the inexorable law is a falling rate of profit.
Right.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So then Holland continues, same page. In Anti-Oedipus, deterritorialization and reterritorialization designate the two moments of the specifically capitalist debt management process Deleuze and Guattari call axiomatization, whereby flows of abstract or liquid wealth in money form and abstract labor, labor capacity in commodity form, are brought together and endowed ex post facto with concrete content in order to produce a surplus to pay the infinite debt.
Okay.
Okay? So let me read this again. In Anti-Oedipus, deterritorialization and reterritorialization designate the two moments of the specifically capitalist debt management process Deleuze and Guattari call axiomatization, whereby flows of abstract or liquid wealth in money form and abstract labor, labor capacity in commodity form are brought together and endowed ex post facto with concrete content in order to produce a surplus to pay the infinite debt. So, as we saw above, unlike with Marx, who prioritized production, Deleuze and Guattari prioritized debt. With debt, particularly in like a late-stage capitalist type of situation in which we exist, the debt grows ad infinitum. It's continuously expanding. You know, look at the U.S. Congress. We raise the debt ceiling. We raise the debt ceiling. We raise the debt ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
The debt is expanding all the time. This debt has to be paid back. So the axiomatization is the principle of this must be paid back. And so production, any kind of production, is now geared towards producing surplus to pay down this ever-increasing debt.
Right. Makes sense.
And one result of this, I highly recommend listeners get into Mark Blythe, is about austerity.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's interesting.
Austerity is a political movement response to debt management. You know, we have to tighten our belts. We have to cut. We have to get rid of social welfare programs because they're too expensive, because that's money that would go to, so they say ostensibly, reinvestment into expanding growth in the economy, but a lot of it is shoveled over to pay the debt.
Right.
Okay. What happens under austerity? You know, people lose their jobs, and then, you know, if you're not careful, this will slide into exploitation and oppression, repression.
Right.
Okay. This is a political outgrowth of this.
Okay.
All right. So moving to the next page, number 153. Holland says, capitalism is described as the mode of production that constantly defers its own crisis. Older capital becomes relatively less productive, and the rate of profit approaches zero. But then newer, more productive capital intervenes to restore, for a time, the rate of profit, thereby displacing the limit. On this view, there is no solace to be found in history, via the immiseration of the proletariat, for example, or the exhaustion of natural resources. For all capitalism ever confronts, are its own limits, the periodic depreciation of existing capital. All it repels or displaces are its own limits, the formation of new capital and new industries with a high profit rate. And all the while, capitalist deterritorialization implacably strips of its halo all pre-existing coded meaning, fostering the kind of free-form investment of desire based on difference rather than identity that Deleuze and Guattari calls schizophrenic, in Anti-Oedipus and Nomadic, in A Thousand Plateaus.
Okay. So what exactly do they mean by schizophrenic and nomadic?
Well, let's look at history first. Okay. So in the classic Marxian sense, Marx did have a theory of history. It wasn't entirely fleshed out. But it is teleological in that what's going to happen? Eventually, the falling rate of profit is going to precipitate a crisis within capitalism from which it cannot overcome. And then capitalism will be overthrown, and then socialism, communism is ushered in.
Okay.
Okay. That's in a nutshell what the Marxian theory of history is. But Deleuze and Guattari here say that this is a problem. Why? It's because capitalism is kind of like a cockroach. Can't kill it.
Yeah.
Seriously, it's like a cockroach. It can't kill it. It runs up against...
You use the same analogy for postmodernism.
Yes, we could.
Yeah.
Postmodernism is like a cockroach. It just scurries away. But the point here is that capitalism runs into crises, and we've seen many crises in capitalism. Capitalism has been around for 500 awesome years. We've seen crises, panics, crashes, depressions, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So these are all products of capitalist economies, even mixed economies. But what happens? Just when you think that capitalism is down for the count, it gets back up, and then it goes in a different direction.
Right.
Okay. So as Holland mentions here is that, yeah, the rate of profit is going to fall and it's going to approach zero, but you shift, you reterritorialize to another capitalist effort that is more productive with the capital, redeploying that capital into something that is going to get back to what profits were before and even surpass those profits. Okay, so it displaces the limit. So what he's saying here is that no solace to be found in history. So you think that in the Marxist view is that eventually socialism, communism is going to be ushered in. Think again. It's not going to happen.
Right.
Because there's no teleological approach to history of this, just because of the way capitalism operates. It's down for the count, gets back up, and then it goes off in another direction. Down for the count, gets back up, goes off in another direction. Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting point by Deleuze and Guattari. I think that makes sense.
And something else to underscore is that both capitalists and the workers are stuck in the system. You usually focus on the exploitation of the workers, but the capitalists don't necessarily have, it's not a bed of roses for them either. Why? It's because they're the ones that are worried about redeploying their capital, losing their profits, and possibly being beaten out by a competitor.
Right.
Okay. So if they can find a way to maybe cheat the system or find a way to really detach themselves from their own limits, surpass those own limits, they're going to do so.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. So Holland continues in the next paragraph. By fostering difference in this way, capitalism frees labor and libido, which is the psychic investment, from illusory objective determinations and thereby inaugurates the possibility of universal history. But at the same time, capitalism prevents and defers the realization of universal history by resubjecting free productive energy to the alienations of private property and the privatized family, to capital and to the Oedipus. Okay, so capitalism is pointing to the possibility that there is a universal history, but it cannot be realized because of this redirection, this reterritorialization of psychic energy and production.
Which means that capitalism is never killed.
Right. It's never killed.
Okay.
Okay. So then later on, Holland says, universal history is therefore a history of contingency. Let me say this again. Universal history is therefore a history of contingency, not of necessity, of contingency. Indeed, following Ferdinand Braudel, famous French historian, among others, Braudel also wrote, I think it's a 3 to 4 volume history of capitalism. Very, very highly regarded. I've read part of it before. Deleuze and Guattari insist that the emergence of capitalism in early modern Europe was a historical accident, which could have happened elsewhere, or nowhere at all. The emergence of capitalism appears in this view as a contingent bifurcation point. Capitalism, in fact, emerged from the conduction of free labor and liquid wealth, and this fact changes everything. But it could equally well have not happened or happened otherwise. Okay, so against the teleological approach to history, where capitalism emerged from more primitive forms of accumulation, this is Marxist theory. That was the universal history. But in this case, according to Deleuze-Guattari following Braudel, is that universal history is contingency. Capitalism emerged 500 years ago in Europe. Could have emerged in Asia 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Why did it emerge in Europe? It's kind of hard to say. It was a confluence of different situations, movements, or whatever it is that brought it into being. It was contingent, a historical accident.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
So understanding that it's contingent is actually beneficial, because if you think in terms of teleology, is that it started from here and then it's going to go to here and there's nothing that you can do about it. Not so. We don't know how much longer capitalism is going to exist. It's been around for 5 centuries. It could exist for another century. It could exist for another 50 years. Who knows? If it existed for another 50 years, it might still exist in some form, but not how we know it today. Just like how capitalism itself, we're talking in Marxist times, large-scale industrial capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, that kind of doesn't exist anymore. There's still production, factory production, but you don't see it in North America. You see it in Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's contingent, specifically in terms of it possibly not existing in the future, though, isn't that sort of contradictory with the notion not long ago about how capitalism can never be killed or something like that?
Well, we have to be careful when we say it can never be killed. It seems like again, like a cockroach. It's hard to kill. It doesn't mean that capitalism is going to exist for all eternity.
Okay.
It's just that whatever has been done to try to upset capitalism has been either unsuccessful or successful for a time. And this is one of the reasons why mixed economies, such as you have a capitalist economy with social welfare programs,
Mm-hmm.
is a mixed economy. Why? It's because those who put it in place realized, in part, that capitalism gives us all the goodies. Or more importantly, is that there's only so much that you can do about capitalism. If you try to restrain it, as they did in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, collectivization and all that, that brings a whole raft of other problems that capitalism doesn't engender. In fact, it could be worse.
So
Yeah,
the contingent factors, such as those in social democracies, are why capitalism hasn't been killed yet, but there could be different contingent factors that contribute to capitalism eventually ending at some point in the future.
sure. One possibility is that you exhaust the Earth's natural resources at some point in the future. Okay.
Right.
If you do that, then we're all fucked. Capitalism certainly wouldn't survive, but probably the human race wouldn't survive either.
Even if we create some sort of infrastructure based on renewable energy sources.
Well, that's possible too, but would capitalism necessarily engender that? Hard to say.
It certainly doesn't seem to right now.
Doesn't seem to right now. Doesn't mean that in 100 years it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
See, that's the thing about predicting the future. Nobody can say that.
Yeah, of course.
And it's also somewhat fallacious to think that progress is universal or progress operates in a straight line.
Of course, yeah. Like if historically speaking, that seems to rarely be the case.
Right. So the whole point about this contingency is that history doesn't progress in a straight line. It could zigzag, take a few steps back, be stagnant, dormant for a while, and then go off in another direction.
Yeah.
This is the universal history. It's a history of contingency, not of a linear progress. Things are getting better and better and better and more complex all the time.
Right.
Okay? So moving right along, page 156, Holland continues. Rather than a continuous development of productive forces punctuated by revolutions, ushering in new modes of production, Deleuze and Guattari conceive of history in terms of reverse causalities, bifurcation points, and thresholds. Okay? So we were just talking about this. Continuous development of productive forces punctuated by revolutions. For example, steam power, electricity, the telephone, the personal computer. All these are revolutions of the productive forces, ushering new modes of production, with the personal computer moving away from large-scale industrial production to software production, IT. Now we're into data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. Doesn't mean that physical industrial production went away. Again, you just don't see it in North America like you once did. Okay. But there's no development. Okay. It's just up, 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 up. A new revolution takes it to another level. Another revolution takes it to another level, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So reverse causalities, bifurcation points, meaning you're going in one direction and then it splits, and thresholds. They reject not only linear historical materialism, but orthodox Marxist dialectical materialism as well. So referring back to an earlier question, Deleuze and Guattari were Marxists, but they were very critical of Marxism as well. Okay.
Yeah, that's important to remember.
Yeah. So then continuing. Nowhere is this clearer than in the case of money. Marx's presentation of the relations among exchange, money, and capital can give rise, and has given rise, to the impression that money exchange evolved from barter and then into capital proper. Okay, you see this in Marx. That first there was barter, then money existed as a means of exchange, because if I lived here and you lived on the other side of town, or you lived in another village that was far, far away, doing barter was a little bit difficult. Instead, if you had a marketplace, you exchanged money, and you use that money to purchase something else of equal or lesser value. That's how it evolved. And then it went into capital. Capital is the store of money or the store of resources that you have to create something in order to create a profit. Okay, they're criticizing. They're criticizing
emotional capital you mentioned too, right?
Right. They're criticizing this. This is the classical Marxist approach.
Right.
The historical record, Deleuze and Guattari insist, shows otherwise. Money first arose as a vehicle for imposing and collecting the infinite debt. In connection with imperial tribute and taxation, and only much later became a medium of commodity exchange and then wage payments. It is therefore not the state, capital S, that presupposes a mode of production. Deleuze and Guattari affirm against the grain of a certain Marxism, but quite the opposite. It is the state that makes production as a mode. Okay, so in other words, economics did not precede the state, or the market did not precede the state. It's the other way around. The state, and I've seen this in other critics before, is that the state creates the conditions for the market, and then it creates production.
So it sounds like the state is necessary for creating markets.
It does. Now, why would a state be necessary to create a market? Because a state is the one that creates and enforces property rights.
Okay.
All these go into the capitalist system exists, the market. Because markets are not just about barter and exchange. That works, but only to a certain extent. It could be inefficient at a larger scale. On a larger scale, you need the state, and the state is the one that creates the market. Now, some people might get pissed off about that. That seems to be the case when you stop and think about it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can definitely like anticipate libertarian objections to that, for example.
Right. Let's not get into libertarianism now. All right. So, let's see. Continuing on, Holland says, the imperial state form entails two apparatuses of capture. Tribute, which is you must give money or whatever goods it is to the sovereign, the king, emperor, or whoever it is, and ground rent, to which capitalism adds a third apparatus, capital. Tribute or taxation and ground rent. Okay, so tribute, you give it to the king. Taxation, the king takes money from you by force. You pay your taxes because the taxes go to fund operations, fund wars, and so on. Ground rent, you pay for the privilege to occupy this certain area. And then capital. Capture is the machinic process whereby a direct comparison of land, labor, or goods enables a monopolistic appropriation of rent, profit, or tribute. The first moment presupposing an established stock constituted by the second moment. So instead of surplus arising from production, as in conventional Marxist accounts, production, according to Deleuze and Guattari, arises from surplus. So capital is a form of surplus, and the surplus is what the capitalist wants, because they can redeploy that surplus to do other things with it.
Okay.
Okay. Continuing, next page. Deleuze and Guattari also agree that once capitalism constitutes itself in a single stroke, through the conjugation of labor and capital, everything changes. The state henceforth becomes subordinate to capital as the dominant apparatus of capture. The transcendent imperial state transforms into modern or civilized states, which now serve as so many different models of realization for worldwide capitalist axiomatization. The socialist model, the liberal model, the dictatorial model, and so on. The economic as social problem is, as always, determinate, but it now determines the capitalist economy itself and the capture of surplus value to be dominant, rather than the state. So, in other words, the state, as we had just said, determines the market, sets up the apparatus. Capital then captures the state and uses the state to do its bidding. This is a complaint nowadays. Corporations have too much influence over politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations, big capital, the politicians represent the state. Now, it depends on what kind of state emerges. You have a socialist state, you have a liberal state, a dictatorial state, and so on. You see this in today's world with many different countries. We happen to live in, relatively free capitalist, socialist, liberal models. We certainly don't live in African dictatorship.
Right.
Okay. These are the different configurations from capital. All right. So then continuing on to the next page, page 158. All right. So Holland mentions Foucault. There, building on Foucault's analysis and discipline and punish, Deleuze distinguishes three forms of power: sovereign, disciplinary, and control. Sovereign power corresponds to the despotic or imperial state and involves the right to tax and to take life. Disciplinary power, as Foucault himself also acknowledged, corresponds to an early form of capitalism and involves the right to profit and the disciplining of life to maximize its productivity and reproductivity. It operated, as Foucault showed, by disciplining subjects in specific, relatively discrete institutions whose function was to reproduce certain models of behavior: the model worker, husband, student, and so on. Profit was captured at the factory, with other institutions playing merely supporting roles in preparing workers and consumers for their respective positions in the economic system. Control corresponds to the contemporary form of capitalism, characterized by the complete subsumption of society by capital, and by its increasingly high speeds of de- and reterritorialization.
Okay.
Okay. So they mentioned Foucault here and its configurations of power, disciplining subjects.
Yeah, Discipline and Punish is a great book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going to the next page, 159. All right, so I'll skip some of this. This is more of a description of control. Deleuze also covered this in the postscript in the Societies of Control, that one essay that Cuck Philosophy covered, so you can go watch that video. Let's see. Next page, talking about general intellect with machines. I think we can skip that. Okay, so the last paragraph on that page. Holland says, social cooperation is no longer only imposed from above on the shop floor by managers, but is embedded in the production technology itself. This is in reference to machines. So in the control regime of advanced capitalism, computer technologies not only enable the high-speed capture of continual modulation, but also and conversely embody social cooperation, a machinic form of cooperation that no longer depends entirely on the subjective consciousness of workers, since much of it is embedded in technical machines. This is another important sense in which advanced capitalism adds an element of machinic enslavement to social subjectification, inasmuch as capital has saturated the entire social field and the line between human and machine has become blurred, with both serving capital in the production and private appropriation of surplus value. So in other words, with the introduction of machines, that we have said before are much more productive than workers are. And in fact, as a capitalist, one would prefer a machine over a worker, just because of production and because of lower costs. But now in late capitalism, and late capitalism stemming from in the 20th century, with this fusion of a machine and a worker, so although there are machines in the capitalist production system, workers are still there to manage the machines, to repair the machines, and so on. They then become fused in a sense. And this fosters and continues a regimen of control, because one is controlled by the rhythm of the machine, one is controlled by the operations of the machine. You have to learn how it works. And one is controlled by possibly you can't compete against the machine because the machine can do it faster than you are.
Okay.
Okay. So what you're seeing here is that capitalism, once again, is a system of control. Not really just a production, but a system of control.
I can see why a lot of people wouldn't like that statement.
Right. But stop and think about it. How many people really like their jobs, even if they're cognitively complex?
I think the minority of people, I would guess.
The minority of people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all this talk about passion in your job, I think, is just a load of horseshit. Because are you really free? Even if you were an entrepreneur, quote unquote, you're still kind of a slave to machines or processes or even people that are in the marketplace.
True. Yeah.
Something that's often not talked about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's like how if I've found out that if I want to be like an independent journalist of some kind, or even like any kind of journalist that actually gets jobs that pay anything resembling decent money, you need to have some sort of degree. Otherwise, most people won't even consider you.
Right.
So you're like controlled by the requirements for that job, basically.
Right, a credential, which is a
Yeah.
separate topic of discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so next page, 161. Okay, now we get into class struggle. So, critics of Marxism, Jordan Peterson, are you listening? Like to talk about class struggle. Okay, yes, that is one of the most often quoted things about Marx, is that hitherto the history of class struggle, Communist Manifesto. Okay, haven't even read Capital. It's always pointing back to the Communist Manifesto. So I won't even go what Jordan Peterson has to say about class struggle. We're looking at Deleuze and Guattari. So they define it in a different way. They devalue it, in fact. They say, in their view, class struggle is not in itself revolutionary because there is actually only one class. The class of all those constituted by their admittedly very different, even opposed, relations to capital and its axioms, whether it is worker, manager, technician, owner, or whatever. The regime of real subsumption means that any activity of any person is susceptible to axiomatization to the extent that it can be formalized or quantified. This includes factory workers, who as producers and consumers are merely incarnations of capital, as it circulates in various forms throughout controlled society. So in other words, instead of taking the classical Marxist tack, which is ripe for criticism, is that there is a class struggle between the bourgeoisie or capital owners and the workers. No such thing exists in Deleuze and Guattari's view because everybody is part of one class working within capital. One might be an owner or a manager, one might be a worker or a technician. The problem is everybody can be formalized or quantified, axiomatized.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So this whole thing about class struggle, it's a red herring. That's not the real problem.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, continuing. This was a, yeah. So Holland says, Deleuze and Guattari conceive of Fordism, for example, as a set of worker axioms. So Fordism is the large-scale industrial assembly line. That's what Fordism means.
Like based on Henry Ford?
Based on Henry Ford, exactly.
Oh, okay.
including axioms of consumption, the single-family house, the powerboat in the driveway, as well as axioms of production, the technology of the assembly line that effectively incorporate workers into and subordinate them to capital. So in other words, one could be an owner or a manager, one could be a worker, a technician, or whatever. Single-family house, that's your choice of dwelling. You have the fancy car. No, even workers can afford fancy cars. You have a powerboat in the driveway. Even workers can afford powerboats in the driveway. Okay. Axioms of production. Everybody's working on the assembly line. One might be working on the line, others are working in the office not far from the line, directing everything. That's what they're talking about with axiomatization.
Okay.
So continuing, Holland says, Keynesian economics and the New Deal were axiom laboratories, as was the Marshall Plan, the plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. But it equally includes, say, hip-hop music, which gets captured and becomes a fashion standard of consumption and a source of surplus value, more or less completely voiding its apparent outlaw or contestatory stance.
That's interesting.
Yes. Now stop and think about it. This is not a new criticism. Any kind of social or artistic cultural movement that at the time seemed edgy or it had an outlaw status, once capitalism gets its mitts on it, what happens? It becomes subsumed.
Yeah, it gets commoditized.
Gets commoditized. Like the mention about hip-hop music. You know, hip-hop emerged, when was it? Late 70s, early 80s. Okay. Certain kind of music. Now fast forward 25 to 30 years later, what's hip-hop music? Beyonce, Rihanna.
Are they considered hip-hop?
They could be. I don't listen to hip-hop, so I couldn't say. I'm just assuming. But, you know, they have record contracts, they go on tour, blah, blah, blah. And this is a mere 30 years after people like Grandmaster Flash in New York, something that was edgy and outside of mainstream.
And like a huge thing that rappers talk about today, like almost regardless of what type of rapper they are, is like they brag about being rich.
Yeah. Yeah. So what the hell happened?
Yeah.
Well, this is capitalism at work.
Yeah.
Okay. So next page, page 162. Holland continues. Axiomatization is the way capitalist enterprise and the, quote, civilized state manage subjectification and enslavement to capture surplus value throughout controlled society. Hence the imperative to create minor lines of flight to avoid capture. This is a key term in capitalism and schizophrenia called the lines of flight. As they never tire of pointing out, the standard, for example, white male European, can be, and indeed often is, a statistical minority, and yet still represents the norm. Conversely, a statistical minority can be standardized, as for example, when ethnic groups seek recognition and civil rights from the state in the form of identity politics. Dun, dun, dun. Or unionized workers seek state recognition and bargaining rights vis-a-vis capital in the form of, quote, class struggle. The minor, by contrast, is defined as a non-denumerable set, an ad hoc group or movement whose cohesion defies formalization and quantification. And quoting from Deleuze and Guattari themselves, they say, quote, what characterizes the non-denumerable is neither the set nor its elements. Rather, it is the connection, the and produced between elements, between sets, and which belongs to neither, which eludes them and constitutes a line of flight. The axiomatic manipulates only denumerable sets, whereas the minorities constitute fuzzy, non-enumerable, non-axiomatizable sets. In short, masses, multiplicities of escape and flux. Okay.
So are they saying that one part about identity politics, that's in the essential aspect of capitalism or an inevitable aspect of it or something like that?
It's very closely connected to it. Again,
Okay.
the term is axiomatization. So what they're saying here is that the whole thing about identity politics, okay, let's take a somewhat more trivial example like gay marriage, all right? So for a long time, gays were the other. Gays were
Mm-hmm.
marginalized. They did not have the same rights as, maybe the statistical minority, white people, versus what has historically been called minorities when there's more
Mm-hmm.
numerous of them. Okay. So now gay marriage has been legalized. Okay. So the argument is, what were the gays doing all of this time? Some gays were just like, I'm going to live my life however I want to. Damn everybody else. And they did. But then there were activists who were like, they want to make it legitimate. So they go to the state and then they lobbied the state for however many years it was until the state gave in and they recognized gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
They became axiomatized. So now what you find are certain kinds of benefits with employers previously reserved for standard heterosexual couples are now extended to gay couples, homosexual
Right.
couples. Okay?
Right.
They've been axiomatized. Identity politics. Certain identities, minorities, whatever it is, want to be recognized by the state. Whereas before, maybe they were outcasts, outliers, or they just didn't give a shit about it.
A good example of this is like the recent conversations we've been hearing about reparations for slavery for Black
Yeah.
people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now they've been beating that drum for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So it's nothing new. Now, in the case of capitalism, a much better example, a hallmark of this is unionized workers. Okay. Seeking state recognition and bargaining rights. Okay. So in late stage industrial capitalism, particularly what you saw in the 50s, 60s, and up until the 1970s, you had you had big industry and then you had big labor. United Auto Workers unions, those big kinds of unions that negotiated with the owners of capital, GM, automotive companies, or whatever it was, for hours worked, pay, salaries, benefits, and so on. Periodic renegotiations of a couple of years. Okay. They both were part of the capitalist system.
Mm-hmm.
The companies needed the workers needed the company for their pay and for their benefits. And then that started to change in the 70s, really started to change in the 80s, and really picked up steam in the 90s with globalization. Now, globalization has been, by and large, a boon for big capital because it's not localized, it's not rooted to one particular place, so they can tell unionized workers to go take a hike. It's because they have no bargaining power. They have no leg to stand on anymore.
Right, because you can outsource your labor.
Correct. So, but, the thing about labor is they're still seeking they've given a lot of concessions, but they're still seeking somewhat of a similar arrangement to what they had in years past, where they
Right.
probably would have been better off to become using Deleuze and Guattari's languages to draw their lines of flight and saying that this no longer works. We're throwing money down a rat hole. Let's just do something else and live a different way.
Right.
And axiomatization, as they say, is for the denumerable. You can count this, you can lay this out, and so on. But the point is, you're trying to draw lines of flight to escape axiomatization, to be brought into capitalism with all of its downsides. But it's neither the set nor its element. It's the connections. One group over here has some members that are talking to another group that's over here. Maybe they operate in similar spheres, or they might be completely different. But yet there's this connection that happens between members of the two group. A multiplicity emerges. We've seen this term before. Then they escape from the two and form another group.
Right.
See how
Right.
this works?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's go back to, let's take as another example, Occupy Wall Street. Okay. One could say that Occupy Wall Street was non-denumerable and that it was trying to escape axiomatization. But really, was it? Because as some critics pointed out, and I think they're right, is the people involved with Occupy Wall Street were looking for a way to participate in the capitalist system in a different way than hitherto they had experienced, rather than just saying, why bother with being in the capitalist system and just do something else? Now, maybe some people from Occupy went off and did their own thing, but lots of other, because what happened eventually with the Occupy movement, it just fizzled out.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened to those folks? Maybe they got jobs, maybe they did something else, thrown in prison or whatever it is. Lots of different things could have happened to them. But part of it, it seems clear to me and to others, is that they were trying to become axiomatic just on their own terms. And that's not the point.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So ad hoc connections. And then Holland says, and the point of becoming minor, this is one term, becoming dash minor, is to promote compositions of social relations that do not pass by way of the capitalist economy any more than they do the state form. You don't want to become axiomatized by the state either. This may seem quite distant from a Marxian politics premised on the organization of industrial workers at the point of production, in other words, unionization. But in fact, the complete saturation of control society by high-speed capital means, as we have seen, that surplus value is produced throughout society, so that resisting axiomatization becomes a political priority for everyone.
Oh, yeah, you definitely see that today.
Right. So, disparate elements can band together to escape the dominant narrative, the dominant system. Some people want to be part of that system. Other people can't be part of that system through one reason or another. Like you mentioned about credentials. You don't have the credential, you can't participate in the system to a certain level.
Yeah.
You still could participate in the system, but you run the risk of becoming low paid and exploited.
Yeah.
So in that case, you have more of an incentive to draw a line of flight to resist that axiomatization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. It's hard to do it on your own, but if you meet other like-minded and fellow travelers, it becomes easier.
Yeah.
Okay. So then moving to the next page, 163, Holland says, this is not to say that struggle over axioms themselves is unimportant, for Deleuze and Guattari insist on the contrary that it is very important, even determinant. Despite the extraordinary recuperative power of the control regime, they stress that the constant adjustments of the capitalist axiomatic are the object of legitimate structures, and they offer a wide-ranging list of examples. Women's struggle for the vote, for abortion, for jobs, the struggle of the regions for autonomy, the struggle of the third world, the struggle of the oppressed minorities in the East or the West. So in other words, draw lines of flight to escape axiomatization, while probably at the same time working on changing what those axioms are.
Okay.
It's not a fait accompli that we have to live in a capitalist system.
Yeah, for sure.
Remember, universal history is a history of contingency. It was a contingency that it arose. It's kind of a contingency that it's continued and that it's spread.
Yeah.
You don't have to live in it. You don't have to live according to those axioms. You could scrap it and try something else. Much harder, easier said than done, as we all know.
There are people who live off the grid, but it's hard to do.
Right, you can live off the grid, but even then, if you live off the grid, you still could be axiomatized in the wider culture.
That's true, yeah.
Because you live off the grid, but you drive a gas-powered vehicle.
Yeah, okay. or you produce commodities for other people to buy.
Right, right. Your surplus you take to market and you sell it for money, which you then use to purchase other things.
Yeah,
you're still part of the system. But you got to give them credit as that they've tried to reduce their dependence on the system as much as they can.
Yeah.
Okay. So then continuing, Holland says, nevertheless, the best chances for resisting axiomatization and creating viable lines of flight from the plane of capital lie with the becoming minor of non-denumerable sets or multiplicities. This is because of what Deleuze and Guattari called the, quote, deepest law of capitalism, which is, as we have seen all along, is that it, quote, continually sets and then repels its own limits, but in doing so gives rise to numerous flows in all directions that escape its axiomatic. So, in other words, capitalism is even changing its axioms all the time when it runs up against its own limits. It's not set in stone and that it will continue to grow and operate by the same axioms. It
Right.
changes them. For
Right.
example, the shift from industrial capital to finance capital
Yeah.
changed the rules of the game.
Yeah.
Okay. At their best, struggles against capitalist control are bivalent, or what Deleuze and Guattari call undecidable. The struggle around axioms is most important when it manifests itself. When it manifests itself opens the gap between two types of propositions, propositions of flow and propositions of axioms. So, in other words, instead of focusing on this and that, focus on the between, what emerges from the between.
Okay. So the contingencies change, and you change along with them in order to avoid being axiomatized. Is that it?
Yes, that's it. I mean,
Okay.
one analogy to look at is let's say you're walking down a street. Okay, you're walking in a straight line down one street. You come up, you come up to an alley. You can ignore the alley, or you can stop. You can turn, and you can go down the alley. You just deterritorialized yourself from that street to go down
Hmm.
another street. You're still somewhat axiomatized because you're walking in a street and an alley structure, but you have purposely gone down a different path. Now, I believe, now my reading of this is, looking between the two propositions, is that instead of using axioms from something long ago to try to overcome the axioms of today, even when those axioms are shifting all the time, you just be aware of where the gaps are, where the openings are, and then you draw your line of flight through that opening.
Okay.
You can't predict where you're going to go necessarily, what it's going to look like, but you're always trying to escape. I mean, you're kind of like a renegade. You're kind of like a resistance movement.
Okay.
The big occupying army. You know who they are. You can identify them by their tactics, by their uniforms, by their people, and blah blah blah. It's better to be the insurgent fighting against the big occupying force because you can draw your lines of flight and you can be nimble and you can blend into the background. You don't play by the same rules as the occupying force. That's a
Okay.
military analogy.
Okay.
Okay. And the last paragraph, Holland says, from Marx's analysis of the paradoxical dynamic of capitalist development, Deleuze and Guattari derive a political imperative to bring the pressure of non-denumerable minorities to bear on the struggle over axioms, to the point of escaping from capitalist axiomatization altogether, and ultimately altering the global balance of power between connections and conjugations in favor of the former.
Okay.
The, the end.
Okay.
Okay. So that is Deleuze's reading of Marx along with Guattari.
Okay. That was very, very interesting.
Okay. So now let's go
Yeah.
back to our good friend Jordan Peterson. Peterson never talks about this, does he?
No.
It's
No.
all about class struggle, class struggle.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really an oversimplification, to say the least.
Right. Now, Zizek talks a lot about the same things that Deleuze and Guattari does because of, Mark Fisher. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism type of thing.
Okay.
Because we know the problems that are inherent in capitalism, but there doesn't seem to be any alternative that would supplant capitalism, in
Yeah.
part because we seem to have a lack of imagination. We operate according to axioms which probably has outlived their usefulness, which is, we'll just give everybody a free college education, or
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna have a green economy. Okay, you're gonna have a green economy. That probably is not going to look that much different from what the already existing economy is, whether it's industrial scale production, software engineering, or whatever it is. Those kinds of axioms that are still in play. You're just repurposing them or coming up with slightly different ones that are in the same ballpark type of axioms.
Right.
That's not the point. You are trying to escape that.
Right.
How do you do it? Pay attention to the gaps, draw your line of flight, and go forth.
So Deleuze and Guattari are saying that you want to escape capitalism in that way.
Yes, you want to escape the oppressions that are in capitalism.
Okay.
Okay, because again, let's bring Thaddeus Russell into this. Okay, so Thaddeus Russell, what's one of his projects? He talks about the renegades
Mm-hmm.
in history. The renegades were the ones that drew the lines of flight.
Yes.
Okay, and his thesis is they were the ones that made American history
Yeah.
under the surface, from the usual cast of characters like presidents, politicians, inventors, and so on. Prostitutes, thieves, the mob,
Drunks.
gun runners, people that ran speakeasies and things like that. They were very much an integral part of history. They were the ones that were the outlaws, the outcasts. They were the ones that operated in the interstices, the little gaps between the axioms. So if you want to get an example of what they do, look to the renegades. Too bad we
Mm-hmm.
don't have Thad on this. He probably would be very much a fellow traveler from what Deleuze and Guattari say.
Yeah. Well, yeah. He talks. I love when he talks a lot about that in his book, Renegade History of the United States, the like how America was shaped by people who would have sex and dance and drink all day while working, and like you said, prostitutes and thieves and like everything in between.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's all I got.
All right, thanks. So that was educational as always, and yeah, I'll say all the stuff I like to say at the end of my videos here, and then you can give any last words you want to there. So, thanks to everyone so much again for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast, Delusional. Are there any other essays after this one? I don't remember.
Yeah, there sure are. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
Oh,
12,
lots.
12 more essays, but I'm going to have to look at some of these and I might decide to skip a couple because we have 3 essays before we get to Freud and Bergson and Husserl and Whitehead, all very well-known characters. The other one's not so well-known, and I'm not sure if they are as interesting to look at, because I think one really gets into mathematics that might be somewhat over both of our heads.
Okay. Well, anyway, many more episodes of Delusional to come. That'll be exciting.
Yes.
And thanks to everyone who subscribes to my channel, and to those of you who share this video and comment on it, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right. Also, remember to actually learn about Marxism before sort of criticizing it offhand. You don't have to be a Marxist or advocate for Marxism to learn about what Marx actually said. And yeah, anything to say to finish this off there, Tim?
Yeah, in the case of Marx, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, is that read the Communist Manifesto, but also read the Theses on Feuerbach, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and Capital. So Capital is a bear. 3 thick volumes. Marx is all over the place in some of them, but definitely go to David Harvey, Harvey. Just go to YouTube and type in David Harvey, Capital Lectures, and there they are. A really good summation of that. They're long, they're in depth, but they're well worth it. And don't try to criticize Marx unless you read Capital first. Please don't.
Yeah, I should definitely check those out. All right. Well, thanks again, and adios until next time, everyone.